Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend Greedy Fanfics with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Had a Cat Quirk. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. His quirk should come in any day now, the doctor jovially said, smiling at Izuku. He grinned ear from ear. His dad coughed, the air becoming a bit smokier as he quietly celebrated. His mom smiled at Izuku. What's it going to be, doctor? His dad asked raspily. Not like Minrai? Izuku hugged his dad's nearest appendage to make him feel better. His dad hacked as he patted his head. The doctor examined his clipboard, murmuring something to himself. Good news, sir. He won't have a quirk anything like yours. In fact, it looks like it won't be like either of yours. It's a mutation likely derived from this gene. He pointed at his clipboard, turning it around. Izuku thought it just looked like a blob. So what kind of quirk will he get? His mom asked. I don't know for certain, but with the extra bone growth in his fingers, teeth, toes, and tailbone, it likely will be some kind of mutation quirk, possibly an animal one. On the top of his skull there's something growing in. I don't think it's a cancerous tumor, though I'd like to keep an eye on it until it's more distinct. As well as that, his eyes appear to be changing in some way, though it's too soon for me to be able to tell exactly how. His mom nodded, picking up the All Might figurine from the floor where Izuku had dropped it from excitement. Can we schedule the next appointment? She asked, politely ignoring Izuku's vibrating. Of course, Mrs. Midoriya. Would. Izuku ignored the rest of the conversation as he prodded at his fingertips. They had felt sore lately, though he'd just chalked it up to all the drawings he'd done. He pointedly ignored the ringing in his ears. It would go away soon, right? Wanna go get ice cream, Izuku? Katsuki should be at the park with Mitsuki. You can play with him. Izuku nodded excitedly, tugging on his dad's hand. See, calm down, Izuku. His dad panted. His mom put her hand on his dad's shoulder. Hisashi, you should go back to the house. Your quirk's hurting you more than usual, isn't it? She said in barely more than a whisper, but Izuku heard it. Why's daddy's quirk hurting him? He asked. His parents flinched. It's not, buddy. His dad tried to reassure him. Izuku glared at him. I'm a big boy, daddy. Tell me. His mom cut in. Look. There's Katsuki and Mitsuki. Izuku grinned, forgetting his question. Kaken. He called, sprinting over to him. Kachan yelled. What the hell, why are you running so fast? Izuku grinned back at him, ignoring Annie Mitsuki yelling at Kachan. I'm gonna get my quirk soon. He proudly told Kachan. So that fast running wasn't your quirk? Kachan glared at him. Izuku tilted his head. No. Wait, what if that was? Kachan, we need to find out. He took off towards the other end of the park, ignoring Kachan's shrieks, asking him if he was looking down on him. They played like that for a bit, testing out things to see if Izuku could do them. He was a bit faster, by a 4-year-old's measurements, and he could jump a few inches higher, but that was it. Your quirk's lame, Deku. Izuku pouted at the name but didn't protest. His attention was attracted by a leaf falling from the tree. He watched it attentively before leaping for it and slashing at it with his nails. He felt his nails practically tear out, and he gasped in pain as he landed. Izuku! His mom cried as she ran over to him. She grabbed his fingers, gently examining the red, irritated skin by his nails. What happened? She asked. Izuku clawed the leaf apart. Kachan yelled, sounding weird. His mom looked to his feet and Izuku followed her gaze. The leaf was indeed torn into shreds. Izuku gasped. Was that my quirk? He looked up at his mom. I think so, dear. She smiled at him, patting his curls. Izuku yawned. You tired, Izuku? She chuckled. Izuku shook his head. No. Just. He couldn't think up a valid excuse and sighed. Yeah. She huffed fondly. Come on, Izuku, say goodbye to Kachan. Izuku mumbled a goodbye and allowed himself to be picked up and carried. Bye. Show me your quirk more later. It's cooler than the other lame extras. But not as cool as mine. Izuku nodded blearily and waved goodbye where he thought Kachan was. The soft sound of his mom's heartbeat and his dad's short breaths lulled him to sleep as they walked towards the car. His last thought before he fell fully asleep was him pouting internally that he got no ice cream. Izuku startled awake when his mom screamed. What's going on? He asked. His mom put her hand over his mouth. He protested before looking up. A man with something shiny stood over his father, who was lying on the ground. He was barely moving. His mom pushed Izuku behind her. "Gee, get away from us." His mom sobbed. The man ignored her and looked down at his dad. "This would have been so much easier if you'd just paid my fee, Hisashi." "Daddy!" Izuku cried. "Ggge et o out of f harako k." The man raised the object in his hand towards his father's head and a loud bang went off. Izuku saw his dad's head slam back into the ground, blood staining the pavement. "Hisashi!" Inko screamed. She raised her hand, the gun tugging towards her. "What are you doing, woman?" the man said venomously. He glared at them and Izuku screamed. "Stop! Don't hurt him. Please! Please!" His mom ran at the man, tear stains on her shirt. "Mommy! Mommy!" Izuku screamed as the man pointed the object at her. "No!" He ran under his mom's arm, ignoring her yelling for him to get back, and lunged at the man. "You hurt Daddy!" He grabbed at the man's neck and wrist, holding the gun. His fingers lengthened and he heard the man let out a strangled wet sound. A loud shot went off and someone screamed. "Izuku!" His mom cried. He ignored her, choosing to watch the man who was choking on something. It was only once he looked down at his hand that he noticed his fingers were in the man's throat. Panicking, he yanked them out, red blood staining his fingertips. "Mommy?" He turned around to his mom, who was lying on the ground next to his father. "Mommy?" He crouched down next to her. She stared at him, her eyes wide but no longer crying. "Mommy. Mommy, the bad man is asleep. Daddy? Please wake up. Mommy. Mommy. Daddy." He was sobbing now as he grabbed at her head. "Please. Stop ignoring me. He screamed as hot pain went up his spine. Every part of him hurt, and so he curled up trying to ease the pain. "Mum. It hurts." He slurred, pain so bad it blinded him for seconds. When he opened his eyes again, the pain had mostly ebbed away and was still getting better. He tried to stand up but ended up falling forwards onto his face. Weird sensations ran up his face and he grimaced. Or at least tried to. He couldn't feel his face move all the way. "What's going on?" he asked himself as he looked down at himself. He yelped when he saw himself. He looked so weird. For one, everything was bigger, but most importantly he had fur. Fur! He staggered to his 4 feet and dragged himself slowly out of the entrance of the alley. A few people who must have been at least 40 times bigger than him walked past quickly. He could fit in their hands. He tried to get their attention but they ignored him. "Why is everyone ignoring me?" he complained as he looked back to his parents. "Don't worry, Mommy and Daddy. I'll get you help so you can get up." And with that he stumbled off onwards where the police station his parents had pointed out a couple times for if he needed help and his parents or teachers weren't near. He walked for a long time but couldn't find the police station. And whenever he tried to ask for help his voice came out as a tiny little squeak and people would either not notice him or look at him, smile and continue on their way. It was so frustrating. Suddenly a shadow came over him. He squeaked and scrambled to get away but not before being picked up by the scruff. He felt himself go limp. Was it a quirk? What was going on? "Poor thing," a feminine voice said. They turned around and started to carry him to an overflowing garbage bin. He unwillingly allowed the mysterious voice to take him to a mewing box. "Wait, mewing? And why is the person carrying him so fuzzy?" He got his answer shortly when she put him next to a bunch of kittens who were a bit smaller than him. He turned his head to see the person carrying him was actually a calico cat. "Huh? What's going on?" he asked. She shushed him. "Don't worry, little one. Did your mother name you?" Izuku opened his mouth before remembering his parents telling him to never tell his name to strangers. Did cats count as strangers? He chose to just shrug. Poor thing. He didn't much like her calling him a poor thing. She was distracting him from getting help for his parents. "My mommy and daddy are sleeping, I need to get them help." She gave him a pitying look. "Did a person make them sleep?" she asked. Izuku nodded, relieved that she was getting it. Then she leaned over him and gently licked him. He paused, surprised. "Humans are cruel, little one. I'm sorry to tell you but your parents are dead." Izuku's eyes widened slightly. His parents had described that when his grandmama had gotten sick and had died, she'd never come back no matter how long he waited. "They're never coming back?" he asked, glad that whatever his quirk was, he couldn't cry in this size. "I'm sorry, I don't think they are. But one of those police can save them." He bit his tongue, yelping in pain when his teeth sunk into it easily. The older cat purred in amusement before becoming serious. "I won't let you go to a human. They're cruel creatures who only hurt us cats." Izuku paused. He looked up at her startling blue-green eyes. "But I'm a human?" he asked confused. The calico looked down at him before meowing in amusement. You're a funny one, kitten. Maybe you should be called Meowarius. Izuku flicked his ear in embarrassment. Wait, his ear? He raised his paw to the top of his head and felt something fuzzy. Was that what the doctor had talked about? He was so distracted with his ear he didn't notice the calico cuff him gently around his neck. He yelped in surprise. Is it your first time discovering your ear? And I still don't know what to call you. She added that on with a tail flick. I don't know your name either. He announced, realizing about 2 seconds later that was a bit weird. Fortunately she didn't seem to care. It's Autumn. Now what would you like me to call you? Or can I make something up? Izuku flicked his ear awkwardly. He didn't want to stay for too long. He didn't know when his quirk would turn off. But she looked so eager he gave in. Okay, Autumn-san, you can give me a name. Autumn looked at him strange. San? What's that mean? Izuku's eyes widened. Right, she was a cat. Nothing. Hey. So embarrassing. Or can I make something up? Izuku flicked his ear awkwardly. He didn't want to stay for too long. He didn't know when his quirk would turn off. But she looked so eager he gave in. Okay, Autumn-san, you can give me a name. Autumn looked at him strange. San? What's that mean? Izuku's eyes widened. Right, she was a cat. Nothing. Hey. So embarrassing. She didn't seem to mind though. How about Cloud? Or Cotton? Moon? Peak? I like them all. What do you want? She was so energetic. I like Peak, Autumn. She purred pleased. Well, once the others properly wake up I'll introduce them to you, Peak. She tested out his name before nodding to herself. Izuku sat down by a blue-furred kitten who was dozing in the pile of kittens. His heart twanged a bit. He wished he had siblings like this. He looked over to Autumn, who was crouched by the flap of the box they were in, facing outwards. Her mottled back rose and fell as she watched the alley. Faint sounds of people walking and talking came into the box and Izuku sighed before curling up into a ball. Was this what a cat's life was like? If it was, he could get used to it. Izuku woke up to someone licking his head repeatedly. It was soothing but also a bit weird. He lifted his head, smacking it into the cat licking his head. Ow. Ha. Told you that it happened, Nemophila. A male voice cackled. Izuku lifted his head up. The blue kitten from before was rubbing her chin while a black-furred male kitten laughed at her in the background. Sure. Laugh it up, Cinder. You won't be laughing soon. And with little warning she launching herself onto him, cutting off the muse of laughter, and turned to play fighting. A small sound came from next to him. Izuku turned his head to see a small white kitten with blue eyes. He stared into the direction of the play fight sadly. Izuku couldn't figure out why. Hi. He cautiously mewed. The kitten didn't even flick his ear. Izuku approached him until he was about 6 inches away, and only then did the cat turn his head. Oh. Hey there, he said loudly and slowly. Izuku winced. Why was he so Izuku flicked his tail in what he hoped was greeting. The kitten stared at him for a bit before huffing. I can read your tongue. What's your name? I can't keep calling you Fluffface in my head. Izuku snorted involuntarily. I'm Peak. He purred slightly at how easily it rolled off his tongue. He looked directly back at the other kitten. What's yours? The kitten startled, surprised though Izuku couldn't figure out why. I'm Sunlight. The kitten wiggled the top of his tail as he crouched down before launching himself at Izuku. Izuku let out a startled yelp before he was under the other kitten. And I'm gonna be a good fighter just like Autumn. He crowed happily. Izuku tilted his head. Autumn's a good fighter? Yeah. Sunlight jumped off him, Izuku releasing a gust of air. She fought a human off one time. Izuku gaped. Really? How? Sunlight purred, seemingly pleased he got to tell a story. The bald creature was coming close to our box, so she jumped out and attacked his ankles. Izuku's mouth made an odd shape that he grimaced about as he bounced around. She beat a person? So cool. He crouched down before jumping back at Sunlight, hoping to get the drop on him. Unfortunately he missed and slammed face first into the wall of the box, falling down with a loud oomph. He didn't miss the laughter coming from the 3 kittens. How can we fight better than a kitten, a cycle older than us? Cinder taunted. Izuku rolled over onto his haunches, his fur raised in embarrassment. Well. I've never fought before. Ka-chan didn't want to play with me that much. He defended himself. The other kittens looked at him. Ka-chan? Was that your old litter mate? What happened to him? Izuku shrugged. I saw him recently and nothing happened to him. He wasn't sleeping like my mommy and daddy were. They stared at him. So you don't have any parents left? Besides Autumn, of course. Nemophila added on. Izuku nodded a bit unsure. Cinder bounded over and bumped into him with his shoulder. Now you're our brother. What's your name? Nemophila snorted and Sunlight flicked his tail. I'm Peak, Izuku said, trying to hold back his purr of amusement. Judging by Cinder's offended look, he didn't succeed. I challenge you to a battle, Peak, Cinder announced. Izuku winced. But you know I can't fight, he whined. Cinder flicked his ear. Then I'll teach you. By fighting. And with that he launched himself at Izuku like how Sunlight had a few minutes before. Izuku flattened himself to the ground before launching himself forwards under Cinder, who was still in the air. Cinder landed, skidding on the box's floor for a second before stopping himself. Oh. Can't beat a newbie, huh, Cinder? Nemophila taunted. Izuku flicked his tail as he darted towards Cinder, who was shaking his head. He bowled into him, crashing them both down towards the ground. They rolled around for a bit until Izuku felt teeth grabbing his scruff and pulling him off Cinder gently. It's time for dinner, kids, Autumn said gently, placing Izuku down. She leaned over before putting a small mouse in front of him. Izuku hadn't even seen her leave. You look to be about the age where you solely eat prey, aren't you? Izuku nodded, not entirely sure. He looked down at the mouse's stomach churning. Did he really have to eat this? He scrunched his nose up in disgust before smelling it. It smelled delicious. He took a tentative bite before widening his eyes. He quickly started to eat, ignoring the other kittens' complaints that they wanted prey too. Soon only bones and a few bits of meat still hung on the bones. Autumn licked his ear. You were quite hungry, weren't you? Izuku nodded. That was delicious, he announced, his tail held high. Autumn chuckled before turning back to the other kittens. Izuku yawned. This quirk must be taking its toll. He was exhausted. He went to the corner of the box and curled up ready to sleep. Leaving to look for help hadn't crossed his mind for hours. Suddenly a fluffy weight plopped down next to him and he opened his eyes. It was Sunlight. Soon Cinder and Nemophila followed until they were in a kitten pile. Autumn approached before wrapping herself around all of them, her orange and black tail wrapped around Izuku's body. The sounds of purring, both his own and his family's, soothed him to sleep. An angry hiss woke Izuku up. He bolted to his feet, looking around wildly. It was still dark out, but the air had the scent of dawn approaching. Peek! Get behind me. Now, Autumn hissed, crouched defensively over her other kittens. Izuku quickly ducked behind her without hesitation. Nemophila whimpered. A loud bark came and Izuku peeked back over her tail. A medium-sized brown dog was standing at the entrance. It was barking excitedly, its tail wagging. Izuku sighed in relief. It was just a puppy. Suddenly Autumn's tail unwound from around him before she lunged at the dog. The excited barking turned to a yelp before a growl. The dog raised its paw, the long sharp claws aimed at Autumn's chest. No, Izuku yelled. He couldn't have another mom die. He ran past Autumn and launched himself at the dog's face. The dog howled in anger as it backed away, violently shaking its head until Izuku fell off. The dog aggressively stood over him. Izuku could feel his fur raise as the dog went in to bite his neck. He yelled as he stood onto his back paws, his front paws held above his head like he was hunting a bird. Bad puppy. He squeezed his eyes shut as he felt his body fold in before widening. It didn't hurt as much as the first time. Geeak. Bad ddd he yelled, his meaty toddler arms held up in front of himself defensively. The dog growled and snapped at his arm and he hissed back at it, his hackles raising. Their standoff lasted a few seconds longer before the dog backed away and ran into the alley. Izuku smiled triumphantly, his sharp teeth poking into his lip. He turned back towards his cat family to see Autumn staring unreadably at him. Finally she said, "You're human." Izuku flinched before nodding sadly. "Emsri," he whimpered out. He could feel himself melting back into his cat form. It felt much better than before. He crouched down to the ground. They were going to hate him now. He didn't want them to. He sat there for a few seconds before hearing soft footsteps approaching him. He looked up. Nemophila had approached him and now her dark blue eyes were right by his. "How are you changing?" Izuku stiffened. "It's my quirk." Nemophila tilted her head curiously. "What's a quirk, Peek?" Izuku was saved from trying to answer that by Autumn approaching. "Peek," she started. Izuku hunched down lower to the ground. Autumn sighed. "My Peek, I'm not mad at you. You protected me and the other kittens. That's not a bad thing." Izuku looked up at her. If he had tear ducts that could cry when he was sad, he would be sobbing right now. But, he continued for her. She tilted her head. But what peak? She leaned down towards him and touched her nose to his. Just don't throw rocks at me or your siblings. Izuku snapped his head up. Siblings? Izuku asked, hardly believing it. Autumn purred. Of course, peak. You being a human or having a human quirk doesn't make me love you any less. Izuku would definitely be sobbing right now. 4 years later, Pete crouched on the edge of the building next to his box. He flicked his tail in annoyance that he'd have to change back into a human for a bit. It was so annoying and clumsy. But if he wanted to fight off people like the one who'd made his former parents die, he needed to change into the human skin. Speaking of parents, he scanned the alley for Autumn. After a bad fall a few moon cycles back, she couldn't hunt for herself anymore. Nemophila sometimes dropped by to help them out, and Sunlight had never left. But none of them knew where Cinder had gone. Izuku shook his head to clear his head of these thoughts. He needed to leave. The monsters would enter the scene soon. The sun was setting and most of the humans were going to bed. Soon the only ones left would be those who hurt and the ones they hurt. Izuku shifted as he quickly grew. It was always a bit uncomfortable. Once he changed, he grabbed clothes he'd stolen a while ago. The first time he'd done this, he'd been chased. After a bit of deliberation, he figured it was because he wasn't wearing a coat like the others. So he'd stolen some from a store which had chased him with a broom a few days before, and he'd never been bothered since. Suddenly he was startled out of his thoughts by a faint clattering and a cry. He quickly turned towards it and sprinted along the edge of the rooftop towards the sound. When he arrived, he wasted no time to flip off the edge of the roof and onto the human with false claws. He yelled out in anger and swung his fake claw at Izuku, who easily dodged before clawing the human's wrist. The human howled in pain and anger and threw Izuku off. Peak easily landed in a crouch by the wall behind the man. He crouched down lower as the man's claw came unattached and flew towards him. This trick had been pulled on him so often that he didn't even flinch anymore. He lunged towards the man, ignoring everything else as he landed on the man's stomach, slamming him down into the concrete. The human gasped before going still. Peak sat up from the human, tilting his head as he examined the man. Unconscious. Who are you? Someone softly asked. Izuku turned his head around, looking at the human who he'd saved. Are you a hero? She asked as she started to cry. Izuku flicked his tail as he approached her slowly. He crouched onto his knees in front of her as he held out his hand. She put hers in it, which wasn't what he'd been going for, but it worked. He helped her to her feet, trying not to stiffen when she tightened her grip slightly as she staggered. He looked down at her pocket before miming holding something to his ear like how other humans sometimes did. The rectangular box could help. She looked confused, so he shook his hand by his ear for emphasis. Her eyes widened in understanding and she took the box out and started dialing. Not wanting to have to deal with the humans who sometimes chased him with metal death by their hips and sometimes tried asking him things that he only halfway understood, he stood up before clawing up a building next to him and crouching on the edge to make sure that the monster was still asleep. Satisfied, he hurried off, his ears pricked, ready to turn at a moment's notice towards fear, sense, or cries of terror. No human would be hurt in Peak's home if he could help it. There's a vigilante in Muzatafu, was what Aizawa was greeted with when he entered Tsukuchi's office. New? He asked. Tsukuchi shook his head. Then why am I only just hearing about them? He asked, extremely annoyed. Was this going to be a case where he had exactly enough information to chase them around in a wild goose chase? Tsukuchi sighed, looking just as tired as Aizawa felt and also looked. Because we've only just gotten enough information about him to properly open an investigation. Aizawa nodded. Where does he work? He watched Tsukuchi carefully, ready to drink up any information. For a while he only worked in a few blocks range and occasionally left if there was a fight right outside the radius. But more recently, as in the past 2 months, he's extended his range. By how much? And how long has he been active? He's been active for maybe a year but only started coming out more consistently in the past 2 months. And what does he look like? What's his name? Do you have any information I should know? And when can I take a nap? He wears a dark purple hoodie with something that looks like a white shirt underneath and gray sweatpants. Aizawa raised an eyebrow. That's an odd outfit choice. What weapons does he use? He added on. He uses his nails and teeth. We originally had him down as a speed quirk who may have sharp nails or knives, as the scratch wounds on his victims were extremely shallow, but one of our more recent encounters with one of our officers, he used his claws to claw up a building. We are now pretty sure that he has some kind of mutation or transformation quirk. A mutation quirk? One I can't erase? Now he could fight mutation quirk types, but like any hero he wasn't as good as emitter types. Tsukuchi looked a bit exasperated. Or a transformation quirk. That's part of your job, figuring out what it is. Anyway, for your other questions, he hasn't given himself a name, so he's currently called Hisser by most of my officers because he hisses like a feral cat whenever he feels threatened. Now Tsukuchi looked even more upset. And by eyewitness accounts he's likely younger than any of your students by far. What? Aizawa snapped his head back up towards him. Tsukuchi sighed tiredly. Unless he's really small and malnourished for his age, we'd pin him at around 6 to 9 years of age. Well, this was shit. Izuku crouched down, feeling his bones shift and shrink down. He purred quietly in relief as he quickly made his way back to the box. He could already hear Autumn asking him what had happened on his patrol of the city. It had been a busy night, with 2 humans threatening a weaker, more scared human, a human who cornered another human, and an escape from a human dressed like one of those clowns. All in all, it was an exciting night, and the worst injury he'd gotten was a shallow claw mark from a monster human. He landed in front of the box, grunting a bit as the wound shifted open a bit more. Autumn would probably be a bit annoyed at him for that. He limped slightly and pretending he didn't see Autumn's eyes on him. Peek. What did you do? She immediately smelled the blood on him and he grimaced. Her nose wasn't as good as it once was, but apparently when it came to her kittens being injured she had an annoying sense for it. Let me see it. Izuku sighed and nodded, lifting his front right leg up. She leaned down examining it carefully. She turned her head slightly towards sunlight and flicked her tail at him a few times until he noticed. He bounded over. What ha? That's a claw mark. What did you do, Peek? Izuku huffed. Why do you always assume it's my fault? He asked jokingly. Sunlight butted him in the forehead softly. That's because the last time I followed you on one of your trips you licked some human fighting another and got kicked in the face for it. Okay, for your information, I bit him. Not licked, Peek hissed annoyed. Sunlight didn't seem to care at all. Sure looked like you did. Peek leapt at him, Sunlight letting out a surprised howl as they fell to the ground and began to fight. Peek ignored Autumn's scolding until she grabbed him by the scruff and tugged him off Sunlight. Sunlight stood up and flicked his tail smugly. You still fight like a kitten, little bro. I'm still older than you, jerk paw. Then why do you still have all your kitten fluff while I'm full grown, human? Izuku slumped over, making Autumn let go in surprise before leaping at Sunlight's face. I'm not a human, you weak-clawed, ugly whiskered hairball. Sunlight squawked in rage at the insults before batting Izuku in the face, his claws sheathed. Only humans make the stupid decision of fighting other humans for fun. He mocked, tilting his head. It's not for fun. I'm getting rid of the monsters. So shut up. He started to climb to his feet before feeling a paw on his neck. Peek. Sunlight, stop this. Sunlight, go hunt or something, and Peek, sit still so I can fix your wound that you're not making better by getting into brawls with your brother. Autumn hissed. We really must have annoyed her. Izuku thought, ducking his head embarrassed. Sunlight quickly scampered out, leaving Izuku to the rage of a disappointed mother. Jerk. What were you thinking, Peek? It's bad enough you pick fights with humans, but now you fight with your older brother while injured? I can't take this recklessness. Why do you even need to fight humans anyway? You still don't look past a half-year-old, Peek. Izuku flicked his ear, embarrassed. Why couldn't he grow normally like the other cats? I need to. My old parents died because of monsters, you know that. I need to make sure no other kitten's parents do. He yelped as her rough tongue caught on a piece of matted fur by his wound. I can do it myself, Mama Autumn. I got it. He flattened his ears in embarrassment before sprinting out of the box. He pointedly ignored her soft chuckling as he ran up a roof. So embarrassing. He finished cleaning his wound. He didn't need another scolding by Autumn on top of the embarrassment of calling her mom. Maybe she'd forget by the time he got back? Something told him she'd tease him about it for a while. He huffed as he changed into the human form. It was a little less uncomfortable than it was the last time he changed, which reinforced his theory that eventually it wouldn't feel like anything at all. He stood up, tottering slightly on the edge of the roof before catching himself. Stupid big paws. As long as he was human he could catch a few monsters. He looked to the sun, which was just peeking over the horizon as it rose. The few ones who went unchecked by the day clowns would be out for another hour. With that thought he hurried along the roofs, listening for any fights. It was only a few minutes before he heard someone calling. But it was odd. The shouts weren't of fear, anger, or disgust. He couldn't place the tone, but he still cautiously approached. Some humans couldn't express their feelings well with voices. This could be one of those. He peeked over the roof to find a human who smelled and looked vaguely familiar leaned up on the wall with something which smelled slightly familiar but very good in her hands. Carefully he climbed down, making sure not to let her see or hear him. He crouched behind a bin as he examined her. She had a relaxed expression but she was a bit tensed. Was she in danger? He approached her softly thinking up the words the blue-coated humans sometimes asked him. He hoped they were the correct ones. P Hato or Duoing? He forced out, grimacing at the words. Speaking with Autumn was so much easier. She swung her head around panicked before showing her teeth. Izuku flinched before pausing. Her teeth showing didn't seem to be aggressive. But why was she doing it? She slowly placed what she was holding on the ground before backing away quickly. She said something quickly, too quickly for Izuku to understand. At his confused head tilt she tried again. Thank you for helping me, she said. Izuku understood most of the words but none of them together. But what she'd placed down smelled so good and she didn't seem to be angry. He approached the smell watching her suspiciously before prying the top off the container thing. Inside was human food, something he hadn't seen since he was a little kid. He purred at the scent before looking up at her. She gestured at it. For you. Sometimes people said that in angry tones before throwing their claws at him or pointing metal death. He froze but when she didn't raise her hand he fully realized she meant the food. He ignored the stick and proceeded to shovel the food in with his hands and face. Only when he realized his family would probably enjoy some of this as well did he realize she'd left. Her scent was still there, and he finally realized where he recognized it from. She must have had some kind of night job. He'd saved her from angry monsters enough times that instead of screaming when he jumped from above she'd stay silent and watch him. He sometimes wondered if she purposely got into stupid situations for fun but it was none of his business. That was why she seemed more familiar, wasn't it? He picked the remaining food up and under one arm, carefully carried it to the roof. Humans were strange sometimes but maybe their strangeness was also motherly like Autumn's. The woman who he'd saved 6 times hurried back to her lonely house. Cobwebs in the corners and crumbling plaster on her walls were what she knew. It had been extremely expensive to buy that katsudon, almost more than her budget could handle. But the small child, one she'd watched catch a rat to eat after saving her the last time, had to need it more than her. He was such a kind young man, she wondered where his parents were. Were they abusive or neglectful? They had to be to leave a child alone on the streets to eat rats and fight creeps. She may be a criminal but she was going to save that child whether it killed her or not. Aizawa read the singular piece of paper Tsukuchi had given him on the new Vigilante. He'd memorized it all already but reading a last time before going out on an information hunt couldn't hurt. Like the last time he checked nothing had changed. He sighed running his hand down his face. He'd only seen child vigilantes 3 times before, the youngest being 13. All of them had come from abusive or neglectful backgrounds. Only one of them did he get to before they were killed. One being Konishianzu, alias Fruit Bat. All he ever found of the small shy 13-year-old was her heart and tongue. And the 16-year-old, Furukawa Akinobu, alias Bright Water. His father had learned about his nighttime activities and in a fit of rage strangled the boy. Furukawa had started Bright Water to avoid his father. In his entire hero career they were some of his biggest failures. He wouldn't let Hisser go down the same path. As he thought this he climbed up onto a roof. He was on the edge of Hisser's preferred grounds. When he found Hisser he'd watch from a distance gauging their skills before as gently as possible detaining them. Personal bonds with young vigilantes only led to oversights, and oversights led to injuries that could have been prevented. It was better to keep them at an emotional distance, an arm's length until they were off the streets and safe. He pushed aside the thought that he still would keep them at a distance. He had to. If any criminal who knew he existed knew he cared about a civilian child even a minuscule amount, even a kid who could defend themselves, that could result in horrific deaths. Too many pros violently lost their families or SOs this way. He wouldn't subject a child to a death like that, intentionally or otherwise. Movement flickered out of the side of his eye and he quickly swiveled his head, scanning the area intently. He quickly but silently stalked towards the rustling from an alley where the shadow had disappeared. As he reached the edge of the building and leaned over, a white blur jumped at his face. SHIT. He dodged backwards, his capture weapon raised defensively as he spun on his heel to the attacker, which was a gray-white tabby kitten. He took a breath and examined the kitten. It was scruffy looking but well cared for. The feral little bastard snarled menacingly at him as it puffed its fur up at him. He raised an eyebrow as he slowly moved towards his belt where he kept a small thing of cat food. Just in case. He slowly moved to a crouch as he opened the bag. The kitten was still glaring at him and he snorted. He tossed the food in between them. The cat hissed and scrambled backwards before smelling the food. With a few minutes of deliberation it crept forwards, clearly ready to run at the first sight of movement. It ate a few bites of the food before backing away and jumping off the building into an alley. Trusting the cat hadn't jumped to its death, he stood up and continued searching for the child Vigilante. Aizawa hadn't seen the Vigilante all night. He frowned. Either the Vigilante knew he was watching and had avoided him like the plague, or hadn't come out that night. Realistically, he knew the Vigilante probably had figured out he was there for him, as there had been a few sirens in his area that he definitely hadn't called. Now that he thinks of it, there was a lacking of heroes in this area. During the day heroes were very active, but at night the streets were barren of any. Maybe he could incorporate this area into his patrol route after he caught the young Vigilante. He stifled a yawn as he stood up from the edge of the tall building overlooking the highway, his joints crackling. Maybe he'd get better results tomorrow. Or would that be today? He mulled over that as he hurried to UA. He needed a nap before he had to deal with teenagers. Or anyone in general. As he entered the teacher's lounge, he was greeted with a blonde in his face. "Hey Shouta, why the long face?" Aizawa glared at him. "I'm tired," he said shortly. Hisashi just laughed. "You're always tired, Shouta." Aizawa grunted in response as he took a cup of coffee, downing it in one go. What did he have to do now? Fill out a report on the information he'd gotten. Hisser. Let's see. Nothing. Perfect. More napping time. Hisashi ignored Aizawa's mood and swung his arm around his shoulder. "What you're working on now?" "Vigilante," Hisashi hummed in interest as he leaned even heavier on Aizawa. Aizawa ignored this and stepped away, leaving him to fall dramatically onto the ground. "Shouta, that was so mean." Aizawa erased his quirk before he could deafen him. He liked hearing, "Thank you very much. I'm tired, let me nap now," he grumbled as he pulled his sleeping bag up. He was too tired to deal with annoying blondes or elusive short kid vigilantes. He slumped over face first onto the floor, confident his coworkers would step over his limp body. And if they didn't, then they were getting thrown out a window. Izuku left the odd human on the roof. The food he had tasted gross, but it was still food. Though he had a few questions. Who was he? Why was he on a roof? He didn't look like any of the humans who had occasionally chased him. He was too dark for that, but he also didn't seem like a monster or a victim. It seemed he was a new uncharted category. Izuku hurried away, glad that the man hadn't seemed to see where he lived. The man didn't currently seem to be a threat, but he may be when Peak helped humans. Speaking of humans, the strange woman who had fed him had returned to that alley a few times. She never brought that food again, but sometimes brought small bits of what must have been her lunch. At first he tried refusing, after hearing her stomach rumble or noticing a small hole in her clothes, but she wouldn't eat it. After a couple days of this he finally gave in. No use wasting food. He saw her throw it in the trash can after she left. He knew she knew he was watching. Strange humans. He transformed once he was far enough away from the human to remain unseen. Tonight he'd avoid him until he knew his motives. Then he'd deal with him. "Vigilante kid." A voice shrieked. He recognized the voice as coming from the lady and hurried towards her. She didn't try and feed him at this time, so it must be a problem. He launched off the roof towards the monster, holding Metal Death at her head. At the last second the monster dodged out of the way, pulling her into his path. Pete barely dodged as he scrambled off a wall and into a corner. Not where he wanted to be. He hissed as the monster moved the gun back to the trembling food giver's temple. He dropped into a crouch as the man babbled. "You'll pay for this, Hisser. You put my mother in jail and I won't stand for this. Get her out or she'll suffer. And don't pretend like you don't care for her. I've seen you two together. You took away my mom, I'll take yours. Give her back, you bastard. She doesn't deserve this, but you do. Die. Die." Fucking D. Peak shot forwards for the human's wrist, biting down hard. The monster screamed, dropping the gun. Peak pushed the human into the wall behind him, feeling something crack between his claws. Good. Monsters deserved pain, especially ones who try to hold others as leverage. The monster balled up his hand into a fist and slammed it into Peak's nose. Caught by surprise, Peak fell backwards as the human yelled incoherently in any language. Izuku felt something warm run down his face into his mouth. It tasted iron. He retracted his claw as he smacked the human's neck. He'd found this place entirely by accident, and they usually collapsed after hitting it. Unfortunately, this wasn't one of those times. The monster barely staggered back before advancing aggressively. "You little shit, that's it." He puffed up and Peak paused for a second out of confusion. That was his mistake. Whitening pain erupted from every nerve of his body. He could have been screaming, he didn't know. Suddenly it stopped, and Izuku opened his eyes to find the monster under him, eyes open wide in surprise. Blood dripped down his neck as he kicked his legs for the final time. Izuku staggered backwards. He'd killed again. He was the real monster. He glanced back at the woman whose expression was unreadable before sprinting away. He ignored her yelling after him. He couldn't be near anyone right now. He couldn't. It was only after the adrenaline ran off a little bit that he realized his wrist was pulsating painfully. He brought it to his chest as he examined it. Kid. Wait. The food giver had somehow escaped his notice in his pain and had caught up. He barely refrained from scratching her in his surprise. He could feel his hair bristling. You need to splint that. She gestured at his wrist vaguely. Izuku frowned. He hadn't heard the word splint before. He looked at her confused. Oh, splint means to support it, you know? I can help, kid. She cautiously took a step forwards. Izuku flicked his tail but let her get closer. She took his wrist gently, but it still jerked in pain. Izuku hissed, barely refraining from biting her. Yeesh, that looks bad. Here, I can help you. She lifted her hand in the air and it started glowing a harsh bright light. Izuku tried to pull away from her but she held firm. Finally she created something that smelled both human and sterile. He twitched his nose in confusion as she started putting it on him. As she did that she started talking. Don't fight anymore with that hand unless you want to make it worse. Don't pick anything up with your hand, and move your fingers to help the healing process along. Izuku looked at the splint as she finished up and let go of him. Izuku examined it closer before backing away. She sighed. I am so sorry, this was my fault. I didn't mean to put you in danger. She lowered her upper body. Izuku frowned. She sounded apologetic and most of those words meant that. You didn't do anything though? He hissed. Stupid tongue. Stupid human mouth. Stupid everything. Why couldn't humans just be normal and communicate through hisses, proper body language, and teeth? Why did they have to be so confusing? When he looked back up she had disappeared. Odd human. He turned into his form leaving the splint on the ground before running back to Autumn three-legged. It was very awkward. It had been a few days since he'd broken his wrist and Izuku was stir-crazy. Autumn hadn't let him leave and his siblings were insufferable. Aw, is Lil Peaky hurt? Was what Izuku was greeted with when Nemophila bounced in, rat in her mouth. He flicked his tail annoyed. Shut up Nemophila or I swear I will bite your fur off. He snapped. Nemophila just chuckled before slamming her forehead into his in greeting. He hissed in pain while she bopped over to Sunlight and did the same. Nemophila, be nicer to your brother. Autumn chided as she stood up from the corner of the box. When she turned her back Izuku stuck his tongue out at Nemophila. She gasped in shock. Autumn. Peek's being rude. She tattled. Izuku spat angrily. What are you, a kitten? Nemophila crouched down. Nope. But you are. Izuku growled at her, his tail lashing. Why were his siblings so stupid? He got up to jump at her. Peek, do not aggravate your injury. Izuku pointedly raised his paw in the air before leaping onto Nemophila. Hey! Get off, Peek. Nemophila howled in anger, squirming around. Izuku tilted his head. What? Can't get me off. You weak? Nemophila glared at him. No, you fluff head, I'm trying not to injure you further as clearly I'm the only smart one out of the two of us. Izuku raised his uninjured paw to bat at her ear before losing his balance and falling backwards into another cat. Nemophila, don't injure your brother. Autumn called from across the box. Nemophila spluttered. Injure? He was the one who jumped on me. I didn't do anything. Izuku smugly watched her. After a second he realized he was still on top of Sunlight, who was wiggling around. Oops. He turned to Autumn and tilted his head until she looked at him. Can I please leave? I promise I won't go looking for fights. I just want to sit on a roof. He gave her his kitten eyes. They always worked. And as he thought, her resolve to not let him leave until he was more healed began to crumble. Okay. But no fighting, okay? If I learn that you got into a fight, human or anything else, then you're staying in here until you're healed, got it? Izuku nodded eagerly. He hadn't really been planning on fighting. He just wanted to go outside away from his annoying siblings. He hurried outside before she could change her mind, changing into his human form. Sometimes mean humans would chase cats, and that would probably count as a fight in Autumn's motherly brain. He walked a few blocks away from the box before climbing one-handed up a building's back alley side. Once he made it up, he crouched at the edge of the building, closing his eyes and taking in the night air. He listened to the blowing of the wind and rustling of humans putting garbage away or opening those huge can thingies. He opened his eyes and examined his claws, extending and retracting them. They were cleaner of blood than they had been in a while. He exhaled through his nose and moved them backwards to prop himself up on them, taking care to be gentler on his right wrist. Autumn would flip out if he broke it further by leaning on it. The night was still, until it wasn't. Pete barely rolled out of the way of the gray thing hurtling towards him. He yelped when he hit his wrist on the edge of the roof as he got up into a fighting stance. His eyes widened when he realized who it was. It was the human who'd given him the food before. He hissed at him. Untrustworthy human. He was right to avoid him. The man dropped his hands down from his weapon and stared at him. Izuku felt his fur bristle at the fact he couldn't see what his eyes were doing. For some humans the only warning he'd get before they'd attack him would be their eyes narrowing. He didn't like that. He felt his tail start to lash and he crouched down feeling his leg muscles tighten, ready to attack. Hisser. Why is a child like you out? Where are your parents? Izuku really needed to practice human. He had no idea what Worm Neck had asked. He hissed again feeling a growl build up in his throat. He didn't really expect it to work though. It only worked on the humans who were weak monsters or who were being attacked by monsters. This man did not seem like a one of those. In fact he seemed like a duller version of the clowns who chased him. Maybe a primarily nocturnal version? While he was thinking he almost didn't notice the man approach. He jumped backwards almost falling off the roof. Fortunately he didn't. Unfortunately the reason that he didn't was because the man used his worm thing to grab him. He writhed and hissed in the weapon trying to get out. Suddenly he had an idea. It was a dumb idea and had little chance of working with this human. He just had a feeling, but sometimes the clown humans would leave him alone if he did it. He took a breath and let out the worst scream he could make. The human loosened the binds slightly for a second before tightening them again. Okay, are you done? The human asked sounding annoyed. Pete glared at him. He was gonna bite this human so hard. Knock it off. Vigilantism is illegal you know and incredibly dangerous. You could die. Is that something your family would want? The tone of the human sounded like Autumn when he fought with his siblings. Unfortunately he understood literally nothing he'd said. He hissed to prove his unspoken point. Worm Neck just sighed and started to drag him closer. Perfect. Soon Pete could bite him. He complied just so he could catch this dumb human off guard. Once he got within biting distance he threw himself forwards and latched onto the human's wrist biting down as hard as possible. The human yelled in pain before taking his hand that he was using to keep him mostly still off the rope and over to Peek's mouth to try and pry it open. While he was distracted trying to gently but quickly release Peek's teeth from his skin, Peek wormed out of the loose bonds. He let go of the man's wrist noting with satisfaction that where he'd bitten there were bloody tooth marks. And then he ran off while Worm Neck was recovering. He had a quick recovery because soon Peek could hear soft footsteps from behind him. He started to randomly dodge and zigzag trying to avoid the worm weapon. Kid, stop running. He heard the human call. He ignored him. Shocker. He jumped down into an alley landing before turning on his heel and running further into the maze of alleys. He turned randomly into it, doing his best to lose the very persistent Worm Neck. Finally, after running for basically half the remaining night, he couldn't hear the human anymore. He ran for a bit longer for good measure before finally stopping. He gasped for air. The clowns had never been this persistent. If this Worm Neck human continued he might actually catch him. Though why so many humans were trying to catch him he didn't know. Didn't they like one of their own being saved from another? He'd seen the blue-furred humans take the monster into a building with their arms trapped while the victim handled with more care. So why did they hate him helping the other humans? While he pondered this he realized that he'd been out for too long. Autumn was going to figure out he'd gotten into a fight. He hadn't even looked for it this time. It came to him. Ignoring his burning lungs he started to follow his scent back to the box. This was going to suck to explain away. Aizawa left his apartment at 9:30. Much earlier than he usually did, but with this kid out fighting crime at all hours of the night he couldn't afford to miss him. It had been almost a week since the last sighting of the kid, which raised a few alarm bells. Could the kid have died already? He shook his head trying to ignore those thoughts. There was no evidence for that, so he would continue as if the kid had been out this entire time. And it was good if he was off the streets, though the chances of a bad home didn't raise or lower at all. On one hand his parents could have figured it out and kept him in to protect him. On the other they could have found out and had a bad reaction. And that was if Hisser even had parents. For all he knew the kid could be in the foster system. He wandered the roofs for hours. He knocked out a few criminals following a woman with clear ill intent and tried not to laugh at a bank robber's failed escape who ended up hanging from his underwear from a lamp post. Aizawa didn't even need to do anything. The idiot did it himself with his own quirk. It was almost 3 when Aizawa finally stopped for a breather on a roof. His patrol would only last for another 3 hours before he'd head back for a short nap and a cup of coffee. He could already feel the warmth setting in on his bones from the hot coffee. He crouched down, leaning his head back. A distant figure on a roof caught his sight. He did a double take before quickly hurrying towards them, his weapon already ready to catch them if they were about to jump. He landed on the roof silently, taking care to walk silently towards them when he saw the ears. A mutation quirk possibly. The person was leaned backwards on their hand, their head leaned up towards the stars. Well, where they would be if the clouds weren't covering them. They were wearing a dark purple hoodie, so dark it almost looked black. Something about that rang a bell in Aizawa's head. He frowned. Why did he feel so familiar? Suddenly it clicked. Was this Hisser? He silently got into a fighting position. The chances of this being Hisser and not just some random kid were dwindling now that he thought more about it. Most kids weren't out at 3 a.m. on businesses' rooftops. But if this was just a random kid, he could add unnecessary trauma. But if they were Hisser, he needed to act fast before he realized he was there. The kid shifted and he stopped thinking, throwing his capture weapon out. The kid was a blur as he rolled to the side, getting into a fighting position. Aizawa noted the yelp. It could help him later. The kid turned to look at him full on and hissed angrily. Aizawa could see where the name came from. Slowly he dropped his hands from the weapon, trying to make Hisser see him as less of a threat. It didn't really seem to work, but maybe he could catch him off guard. Hisser didn't seem to like his silence and started to lash his tail, which Aizawa had only just noticed. He crouched down as if about to lunge at him. Aizawa quickly cut in. Hisser, why is a child like you out? Where are your parents? Maybe he could get a bit of information. Hisser ignored the question, apparently hating it as he hissed at him again, the start of something building up in his throat. He glared at Aizawa, but his look began to grow a bit more distant. Was the kid injured? He slowly started to approach, much like one would approach a feral cat, his hands on his weapon. Hisser startled, leaping backwards off the roof. He let out a startled cry and Aizawa snared him in the capture weapon. Hisser did not appreciate that. He started flailing about, hissing and snarling like the raccoon he'd herded out of his apartment after it climbed through his window after he'd left it open after a patrol. Aizawa kept a tight grip on the bonds, waiting for the Vigilante to tire himself out. The Vigilante hesitated for a second before letting out a blood-curdling scream. Aizawa panicked a bit, worried he'd hurt him, before quickly realizing it was a ploy to get free. He took a breath before glaring at the Vigilante. Okay, are you done? He deadpanned. Hisser just glared at him. Figures. He took a breath. Knock it off, he told the still wiggling Vigilante. Vigilantism is illegal, you know, and incredibly dangerous. You could die. Is that something your family would want? Admittingly, he was just trying to annoy the kid now, get a taste of what his home life was like. But the kid was extremely hard to read. He continued glaring, no sign of a change, even a fleeting one in his expression as he jerked around. Hisser hissed at him again. Aizawa sighed and started to drag him closer, ready to handcuff the child nuisance and go home for the night. Hisser had apparently given up. Smart, most didn't, as he slumped over slightly, not walking closer but still allowing him to drag him closer. Aizawa reached his hand down towards his belt, and that was when the Vigilante struck. He leapt forwards, latching his sharp teeth around Aizawa's wrist and biting down hard. Og, he yelled, letting go of the capture weapon as he tried to pry Hisser's jaws apart without breaking them. He clenched his jaw, feeling his skin break. Hisser let go at that moment, staring at the bite marks on Aizawa's wrist with satisfaction for a few seconds. Aizawa bit his tongue to keep from shouting angrily as the child turned around and sprinted away. Fuck. He wrapped an end of his scarf around his wrist before sprinting after the Vigilante. Judging by the flick of his ear, he knew he was being pursued. His response was to dart around in random patterns to dodge the capture weapon if Aizawa sent it out. Smart. Kid, stop running, he called as he threw his weapon out, coming short. Hisser ignored him and jumped into an alley. Aizawa followed him and chased him. Hisser seemed to know the back alleys well as he easily dodged him into one, never hitting a dead end to Aizawa's frustration. He almost caught him once, when Hisser had slipped on a garbage bag and staggered for a second. But then Hisser had kicked off the wall, causing Aizawa's capture weapon to slam uselessly into the side of a trash bin. After over an hour of this wild goose chase, Aizawa lost sight of him before hitting a cross-section. He swore under his breath before choosing the closest one, hoping this was the one he'd gone down. It in fact was not. Aizawa searched the alleys until his patrol was over and then a little over, but he didn't see neither hide nor hair of the vigilante. Then the worst part was, when he made it to UA, he had to go to see Recovery Girl because of the giant bite marks on his wrist. Why wouldn't you get this immediately checked out? Recovery Girl scolded. He slouched. I needed to catch Hisser. Recovery Girl smacked him in the knee, causing him to yelp. Did you succeed? No? Aizawa huffed as she kissed him, the bite marks healing as if they were never there. He left the room feeling a bone-deep exhaustion. He'll get a quick nap before the brats arrived. He opened the door, seeing every one of them there. He looked at the clock, 5 minutes after class started. He was late. Whatever. Don't wake me or you are all expelled, he threatened as he slumped down face first against the wall. He was probably expelling most of them eventually anyway. They had next to zero potential in heroics. Hisser had more potential, as much as he loathed to admit it, but not many of his own students could escape him. Certainly not these first years, who he'd be at least half a decade younger than, yet could beat B-ranked villains with barely a scratch. He groaned before forcing his vision to black so he could finally get some sleep. He'd think about Hisser later. For now, nap. Izuku slunk into the box trying to look innocent. It didn't work. Eek. Is that blood? Oh my, are you hurt? Autumn rushed over, sniffing him and examining his teeth. Izuku frantically shook his head, cursing the fact he still had dried blood in his teeth. No, that's from, a rat. He nodded to himself. He looked back up at Autumn. She looked unconvinced. You smell like human. Did you get in a fight with a human? Izuku cursed the fact he forgot to bathe himself of all sense beforehand. He usually did that on nights where he did something bad or felt gross. Tonight counted as the first, so why'd he forget? Well, not technically? Autumn tilted her head, unconvinced. How did you not technically get into a fight, Peak? He didn't even hit me. He only tried to wrap me up in the worm around his neck. Autumn stared at him. She could judge him all she wanted. He was right. The worm around his neck? She flicked her tail, seeming to try and make sense of it. Izuku nodded. Yeah. It's like a gray thingy that he tried grabbing me with. But I got out of it after I bit him. Don't worry, I didn't hurt my paw anymore. He raised his paw from just above the ground to show her. She carefully looked at it before sighing. Fine. But please be careful and don't lie to me about that again. She gently butted his forehead. Izuku nodded before bouncing over to Sunlight, who was eating a mouse. He snatched the mouse from his brother and ran off, ignoring his brother's screaming. Soon he felt his brother tackle him down, his wrist slamming painfully against the ground. But he didn't mind. He liked being treated like normal. He clenched his jaw around the half-eaten mouse's body as Sunlight bit at it. He bit off the back of the mouse, the rest falling to the ground where Sunlight snapped it up. He glared at him before walking back to his corner, his nose held high, the mouse's blood dripping down his white muzzle. Izuku smugly looked at him as he swallowed the mostly fur piece of meat he'd gotten. He tried to hide the hacking from the piece of fur that had gotten stuck in his throat. Casually he curled up as he wheezed silently, hoping this wouldn't be the stupid way he died. He yawned once he got the fur out of his throat. He'd take a nap now. Do you want to get ice cream, Izuku? A green-haired woman asked him, leaning down. She seemed so kind and familiar, but haunting so. Izuku tried to open his mouth, but nothing came out. He frowned. She leaned down closer, holding her hands out for a hug. Come here, Izuku, it's okay. She smiled. Izuku stared before hurrying forwards into her warm embrace. My little Izu. She chuckled. Her body went limp and cold. Izuku gasped, barely able to hold her up. He turned his head to see her staring off into the distance, blood dripping from a hole in her head. She reeked of death. Izuku. She cried. Why didn't you save me? Zuku. Where are you? She melted. The goo she was turning into a black-haired man. He coughed, smoke coming out of his nostrils. Hey there, Izuku. He smiled at him. He sounded wrong. We don't blame you at all, ha. He grinned, crouching down. You're still alive. Stay that way. He fell sideways, his eyes becoming glassy. Izuku felt something warm coming down his face. He lifted his hand, expecting to see tears. It was blood. Izuku jerked awake, gasping for air. His fur was stiff and raised as if defending himself, and he felt trapped. He needed to get out now. He stood up and ran out of the box blindly. He needed to outrun the fear. He ran until he could barely breathe and his paws felt like they were falling off. Only then did he crumple into a warm ball of shaking fur. Why couldn't he just be a normal human cat? Izuku opened his eyes looking around blearily. He didn't remember falling asleep. He yawned and stood up wincing as his sore paws pulsated. He stretched himself out and turned to Autumn to ask if he could leave. He froze. He wasn't in the box anymore. He frantically looked around. Had a human taken the box? What had happened? Where was he? He sniffed the air hoping to catch even a whiff of Autumn and his two siblings, but there was nothing. He crouched down, raising his head in the air, pleading that this angle would work. He sighed in relief when he remembered what had happened. He'd had a bad dream and had run out. It was just a matter of figuring out where he was. He exited from under the bridge before immediately hurrying back under. It was sprinkling a bit. He silently cursed. The rain may have washed all scent away. If he was in a new area that was too far from where he lived, he might never find his way back. He silently gathered up his courage and hurried out. Rain puddles from what seemed like an earlier shower splashed beneath his pads uncomfortably. He carefully started to walk across a huge dark gray path. It was much bigger than anything he'd ever seen before. Sure, there was one right by the box, but it was tiny compared to this. He winced as a rock embedded in the path stabbed into his soft pad. This sucked. He was almost halfway through when the ground started to rumble and shake. He looked at it confused before glancing up to see a huge black metal can barreling straight towards him. He turned around and ran back towards the edge of the path. No, 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 no. He felt something hit his leg. He hissed, trying to distract himself from the blinding pain as he staggered off the path. Once he was out of the way of any more tin cans, he collapsed. He gasped, barely able to move his leg. Light sparkled in his vision. It hurt almost as bad as when he broke his wrist. Was this dying? Was this what bugs felt before he fully crushed them? Shit. A voice interrupted his existential crisis. Something leaned over him. Oh my God, I'm so sorry I didn't see you. The voice babbled. The sounds of something being pressed rang through his ears as the man yelled at something. What do I do, Shu? I hurt the poor baby wee. There was a long pause while something murmured in the background. Okay. After your class you need to come to the vet. There was a shorter pause. How do I move him? Izuku blearily opened his eyes. He was doing a lot of passing out lately, wasn't he? He went to sit up but proceeded to fall forwards. Stay still, little one. You got hit, a high-pitched voice said. They gently repositioned him and Izuku couldn't help but lean in. They softly let out a gust of air. Quite the friendly feral kitten, aren't you? Izuku wiggled as large hands carefully grabbed him and moved him. There was a metal rattling before he got placed down. The rattling came back before going still. The ground on which he was placed was soft and warm. It felt safe, like Autumn. Where was she? That thought quickly slipped from his brain like butter as he closed his eyes again. This was nice. He stretched his legs out so the heatless light could hit him better. His head still felt cottony, so he closed his eyes again, allowing the black embrace of drug dreamless sleep to take him again. When Izuku woke up again, he was in a completely different place. Again. He really needed to stop doing this. He stood up, proceeding to hit his head on the side of the container he was in when his leg collapsed from under him. He yipped in surprise as the box shifted. A slow, incoherent murmuring started as whoever was there tried to soothe him. He hissed as he recognized the tone. That stupid worm neck. How'd he find him? He scratched at the metal frame in front of him. He flicked his tail angrily, ignoring the grossly smooth material that he occasionally hit. He needed to get out. Sho, what's going on? He's a bit stressed out. I don't think he likes being in a carrier. You think? The car slowed down before coming to a full stop. Were they leaving now? There was no movement other than them talking about dinner. He took a breath before looking out of the holes in the side of the box. A man with absurdly long yellow fur that stuck straight up sat across from where he was. He was holding something in his hands that he occasionally moved. Izuku turned his head to the other side to see the annoying worm neck who'd tried to catch him when he was human. He wasn't wearing the weird thing over his eyes, but he still had the gray worm around his neck. He wasn't looking at Izuku. Now if Izuku could just figure out how to get out of this, he'd be able to escape. He walked over to what looked like the exit awkwardly, in his defense having two injured legs sucked. He tilted his head as he examined the metal. On one end there was more of it along with more of the smooth garbage he was in. He poked his claw through and pushed it up and down. The latch didn't move. He growled quietly, annoyed at his lack of mobility. That was the one thing humans had better than cats: thumbs that could mess with latches easier. If he was a human, he'd probably be able to open it. But he didn't want to transform around these dirty humans who'd taken him. He hissed angrily, batting at the latch. The loud bang it let out startled the humans who looked at him. The yellow-furred one let out a long breath as he chuckled. "We're almost home. We'd let you out, but it wouldn't be safe. Especially if you try and claw me. I'm driving, in case you can't tell. Hizashi, he's a cat. He doesn't care that you're driving. Shouta, he's scared. I need to make sure he knows that it's safe." Worm Neck rolled his eyes and slumped down in his seat. Izuku flicked his tail, annoyed. Dumb humans. Finally, after a couple more minutes, they truly stopped. Worm Neck picked up his container and carried it out of the metal can and towards a building. He growled angrily, scratching at the gray blanket under his claws. At least it wasn't the gross smooth thing. They walked up a flight of stairs, Izuku still pouting in the corner of the container as the humans unlocked a door. As soon as they closed the door, Izuku threw himself at the side of the box. Worm Neck yelped and fumbled with the box for a second as he clearly wasn't expecting that. "Don't be stupid. You're going to hurt yourself." Worm Neck put him down and fiddled with the latch. It came undone and he quickly stepped back, expecting Izuku to come screeching out. Defying the humans' expectations, Izuku stayed in the box, glaring at them, his fur ruffled in disgust. The weirdly named human Hizashi walked away after watching the box for a few seconds. Worm Neck stayed. So Izuku stayed in the box. They stared at one another for a few minutes. Finally Worm Neck backed down and stood up, leaving the box. Content to stay in the box until he was sure it was safe, even though it stunk, Izuku sat down. This place seemed weird. It was too human. A new odd scent wafted through his nostrils and he looked up. A black cat was staring at him oddly. He hissed, "Wait." The strange cat told him. Izuku felt his fur rise. Wait? Who did this cat think he was? The cat entered the box and Izuku pressed his back further into it as he hissed again, feeling his ears press backwards. "Hiro. Leave the new cat alone." A human called. Izuku stared. "Hiro?" He muttered mockingly. The cat ignored that as he looked Izuku over. Izuku was feeling very judged. He did not feel the vibes. The cat leaned down to sniff him and he jerked. "Hey, stop the..." He froze as he finally sniffed the cat up close. He felt his ears come back up in astonishment. Cinder?" He gasped. The cat froze before looking at him. What's up, Peak?" Cinder flicked his tail nervously as he stepped backwards a few inches. Izuku got up from the back of the box and tilted his head as he looked his missing brother over. Then Izuku leapt at his face. "Peak! What are you doing?" Cinder yelped as Izuku launched at his neck. Unfortunately, with his injured leg and broken wrist, he missed and crashed into the floor outside of the box. That didn't stop him. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed at Cinder. "You leave me as to go live with humans?" Izuku batted at Cinder's ear angrily. His brother was such an idiot. "No. Well, I mean yes, but I can explain." Izuku glared at him. "Then explain." He whacked his tail around, letting Cinder know exactly how he felt currently. "So, should I start from the beginning?" Cinder stalled. Izuku growled, annoyed. "No, start in the middle." "Yes, start from the beginning." Cinder sighed but finally started to tell his tale. "It all started when I was 8 cycles old. If Izuku remembered correct, that was a few weeks before he disappeared. I was hunting a mouse when I smelled something delicious. It was really good, so I went to investigate. There was the human with black hair crouched by a wall." Izuku hissed. "So that stupid human who'd tried to grab him when he was in human form was the one who stole his brother." Peak, why are you angry?" "I haven't even gotten anywhere yet." Izuku spat, annoyed. "Just continue." "Okay. So anyway, I cautiously approached the human. He didn't see me, so I climbed up the wall so I could examine the food up close. If Izuku had hands, he'd be face palming right now. Yeah, he'd accepted food from multiple humans, but he hadn't gone up for fun. For all Cinder knew, Worm Neck could have been a cruel human. He could get off by kicking cats. It smelled amazing, so when the human moved the food aside from his mouth to do something on his black box, I took a big bite. Izuku flinched when Cinder suddenly yelled. It tasted weird but also delicious, and I was so excited about the taste I didn't notice that the human knew I was eating. It was only when he gently jerked it away because I'd eaten like 6 bites that I realized and ran away. At least Cinder used to have some common sense. "But why are you here if you ran away?" he asked. Cinder awkwardly shifted. "Well, I came back to the spot cause I was gonna hunt. Not so I could get more of the tasty food." Izuku kinda doubted that. "I hunted a tiny mouse and then I ate it because I was really hungry. The human hadn't come. Not that I wanted him to, so I left. I came back a couple times because it was great hunting there, but it wasn't until a few times later that he returned. And this time he had something that smelled even more amazing. It was wet and mushy like a dead rat's insides, except it was more gray and wasn't bloody. Izuku tilted his head intrigued. That sounded tastier than the dry stuff Worm Neck had given him that one time. So anyway, I kept coming back and he kept feeding me until one day he grabbed me. I was startled and tried to escape, but he had a firm grip. He took me to a place where they gave me disgusting hard things and gave me a water and bubble bath. Then he took me here, and that's how I met the loud human. Izuku stared. And you never tried to escape? Cinder crouched down a bit. Well, at the start I did try and run out the door a couple times, but it's warm here and they're nice. I don't have to hunt and I never get sick. Izuku hissed, angered again. You can't just leave us for an easier life. We thought you'd died. Cinder's fur finally rose and he snapped back. At least I'm not still an ugly furbrain. Izuku yowled angrily, batting at Cinder's nose. Cinder lunged at him, then rolling over the ground. It was a mix of a play fight and an actual fight. Neither were aiming to severely injure or kill, but shallow scratches were not off the table. They wrestled, both trying to get on top of the other for the upper hand. Izuku hissed angrily, taking out his anger at Cinder's disappearance and at being in Worm Neck's home. He batted Cinder's neck, causing him pause for a second. In that second, Izuku scratched his shoulder. Suddenly Izuku felt something grab his scruff and pull him off high up into the air. The yellow-furred human grabbed Cinder, also holding him in the air. Bad cats. No. Worm Neck yelled. Izuku hissed, showing his displeasure at being picked up like a naughty kitten. Shouta, they fought as soon as they met. The loud human stated. Izuku understood it enough to be offended. He pulled his ears back. Cinder was acting like a newborn kitten. It's not his fault. Worm Neck stayed silent for a little while before quietly muttering to himself, barely loud enough so Izuku could hear. Let's see if we can get them used to each other. If not, then we'll have to figure something else out. Was that a challenge? This was stupid. Worm Neck and the other human, who he hadn't properly named yet, had decided to keep him away from Cinder until they were there to watch them. But they were busy or something, so he'd been locked into a room with weird rocks in a box, water, what seemed like food, and an object which looked like a human bed adapted for a cat. The rest of the room was fairly boring. Dimmed lights illuminating light gray walls as the sun sank below the window above. The ground was soft. He chose to sit on the floor rather than the bed. He wasn't going to listen to any stupid humans. He hissed angrily to himself. What should he name the yellow-furred human? Big Fur? Yellow Fur? Screamy Bird? Bad Driver of Tin Can? So many options. While he sulked in the middle of the room coming up with rude names for the human, he barely noticed the scratching on the door. It was only once it turned to a screech that he looked up from the stain on the ground he was glaring at. Peek. Can you hear me? Are you ignoring me? Peek. Peek, 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 peek. Cinder started up. Izuku twitched in irritation. He ignored Cinder. That became hard when Cinder started to yowl like an idiot. Peek. Why are you ignoring me? It's not my fault you can't hold a civil conversation. Izuku growled before spinning around and stalking shakily to the door. You're the one who ran off to go live with humans. Izuku thrashed his tail, punctuating every word. Cinder stayed silent for a moment before responding. Were you even listening before? I said I didn't try to. The tired human just picked me up. You're the one who went back to him for food. And you said you didn't even try to escape after he took you here. I did not. I said that I tried a couple times. Exactly. You gave up and left us to think you'd died. Izuku tucked his tail under, glad Cinder couldn't see him. Couldn't he understand the hurt he'd caused Izuku and his family? A kitten like you wouldn't understand. Cinder growled angrily. Any trace of his former childish tone had left. Izuku shrank back from the door. He felt a heavy lump in his throat. It quickly turned back into anger. Fine. I'm done with you. Izuku staggered away from the door over to the bedding. He half hoped Cinder would respond. But he didn't. Izuku felt Cinder's presence leave as he slumped down into the nest. Whatever. He didn't need Cinder anyway. He looked up at the window. The sun had left it, leaving the room colder than before. The reflection dimly reflected back into the room, faintly showing himself staring at it. He glared at himself. He wasn't staying here. He was leaving this place. He got back up and approached the window. If he stood on his back legs, he'd be tall enough to see above the bottom of the window. Unfortunately, he was unable to. He stared at it. If he hit it hard enough, would it open? He crouched down, ready to lunge. Worst case scenario, he'd slam his nose really hard into the window and it would throb for a while. He'd be fine. He leapt at it, immediately regretting it. His back leg cramped up and in his distraction he slammed head first into the glass, landing on his broken wrist hard. He would forever deny yowling like he was being murdered to his own death. Aizawa left Hizashi after the distress signal they'd received was ended. Some villain with a major strength quirk had taken nearly 45 people hostage and they'd needed Present Mike there to help distract the villain. Aizawa was there to detain the villain by erasing his quirk and knocking him out. The villain had had most of the hostages in a back room and a child in his arms as he threatened their mother. It was fairly simple. The brute didn't know how to react when his quirk was erased, and in the next breath knocked out. As soon as he took the villain out, he hurried to Hisar's preferred grounds, hoping to find him tonight. Even catching a glimpse of him would be great. There had been no sightings of him since Aizawa had chased him a few nights ago. This wasn't out of the ordinary, but Aizawa had heard the yelp. Hisar had been injured, and judging by his temperament and the fact he'd met him with a broken wrist, he wouldn't be the type of person to stay inside and heal. Something must be keeping him, and judging by the kid's anger and fear around Aizawa, chances were, he wasn't being kept inside by a concerned parent. No. Something was going on with the kid. He'd never seen someone react so viciously to him before. Not even most criminals did. He'd only had a few pitiful assassination attempts. Most of the rest of his fights were with small-time criminals who'd never heard of him or seen him until he had them in cuffs. Of course, there was always the chance he'd arrested the kid's parent. Anger was often brewed by family members hurt. He'd heard the stories. A small criminal arrested by a hero. A few weeks later, an angry sibling or child would attack the hero, often leaving more injuries than the first. As Aizawa considered the options, he patrolled the roofs, jumping down to help a cornered teenager from multiple bigger teenagers, and stopping a break-in on an apartment. But no matter how hard he looked, there wasn't a trace of Hisar. No glimpses, no criminals arrested. Aizawa was the only one patrolling tonight. Izuku's face hurt. Maybe repeatedly throwing himself at the window was a bad idea, but in his defense he thought it would work, eventually, but right now his face hurt too much to do anything else. He turned back to the door and glared at it. As he did that, he caught a familiar whiff. "I smell you, Cinder," he announced. The scent wafted for a second as if the cat had shifted before remaining still. Hoping that he'd forget. Well, tough luck, because he wouldn't. Too cowardly to speak up? Just what I expected from a stupid kitten. A frustrated hiss rose up. "What did I ever do to you? Why do you hate me so much?" Cinder burst out. Izuku rolled his eyes. "I don't hate you, I'm just mad that you're a stupid fur brain." Izuku huffed. He heard a soft plop as Cinder sat down. He approached the door and crouched beside it. "What do you want, Cinder?" He stared at the door, preparing himself to feel more hatred directed at his brother. Wait, maybe not hatred. What was it? While he pondered his feelings, he heard a bang. "Yay!" He shrieked, jumping up and away from the door. "What's going on?" "Peek!" Cinder yowled. His scent wafted to fear and worry. Izuku smoothed his fur out and firmly replied, "Nothing." "Now what is it?" Impatient, Izuku lashed his tail as he stood up. He started to aggressively limp away from the door. "Can we please stop hating each other?" Cinder blurted, sounding desperate. Izuku paused before turning his head. He blinked, surprised. "Didn't I just say I didn't hate you?" he questioned. He heard a soft yelp from the door before Cinder quietly murmured something that even he could barely hear. "I'd hate me too if I was you." Izuku swiveled around. The sudden movement threw him off, unfortunately, and he ended up sideways on the floor. Instead of getting up, he laid there splayed out. "I said I don't hate you. I'm mad at you for making us think you were dead," he hissed, frustrated. Why was his brother such a stupid kitten? "But that's I." Cinder started to splutter. Did he want Izuku to say he hated him? Why would he want that? Izuku weighed the options that would be most likely to get Cinder to not think Izuku hated him. Finally, he came up with a temporary solution that might calm him down for a bit. Of course it could backfire, but it was a tiny risk. "Cinder, I'll forgive you under one condition." He cut into Cinder's confusion, slightly smug when his brother cut off so quickly he choked on his own spit and hacked for a few seconds. "Fine. What do you want?" Cinder said, trying to sound haughty. Izuku flicked his ear, amused. "Help me escape." He was greeted with a surprised mew before Cinder fell against the door. "Hi Wui? Because I want to fight humans and see autumn and Nemophila and sunlight again. You can come live with us again too." Cinder stayed silent. For a second Izuku almost thought he'd left if it wasn't for his scent. "I'll help you escape." Izuku cheered, happy. His brother would finally be coming home with him. Izuku had barely closed his eyes before a clink woke him up. He had swallowed his pride a few hours ago and gone to rest on the human bed. It was surprisingly comfortable. For some reason he'd always thought of humans' items as uncomfortable. After all, his pants that he wore when he was in his human form had been fine at first, but now they squeezed him slightly. It was fairly uncomfortable, but nothing he couldn't deal with. For that matter, why was his hood so hard to get on his head? It used to be big enough to be in his eyes when he fought, but now it was a multiple-minute-long endeavor just to pull it over his head. At least it didn't fall anymore. A quieter thud drew him out of his silent musings and he lifted his head up. A man wearing a fancy-looking outfit with an odd face covering over his entire face had climbed through the window. He murmured something to himself as he stood up, dusting himself off dramatically. He didn't look like the stupid humans who lived here. Izuku might hate them, but he wasn't going to let this human attack them. The man strode to the door and opened it. Perfect. Izuku stood up before running at him. The adrenaline blotted out the pain from his leg, which he was glad for. He lunged at the man's pant leg and clawed at it, growling. Arg! The human started to bellow before trying to bite it down. Izuku yelled loudly. The man wanted to get in and out silently? Well, then he would scream. Cinder! He called out. He didn't want to involve his brother, but with his injuries he wouldn't be able to fight him off alone. Cinder sprinted out of the carrier Izuku had been in earlier that day and with barely a second's hesitation leapt onto the man's other pant leg. Good for someone who'd barely fought humans before. F fucking cats. Get off. The human grabbed Izuku's injured leg and pulled on it. Pete bit down harder in retaliation. The human let out a very high-pitched squeal before dropping to the ground. Cinder howled in pain and Pete narrowed his eyes, lashing his tail. He'd regret that. He scratched his way up the monster to his chest, the monster still hitting at Cinder and Pete, mostly missing. Izuku dug his claws in deeper as he scratched the monster's face. The human grabbed his front leg and pushed it, causing Izuku to slip and fall. He slid a few feet before stumbling to his feet. He growled, feeling his fur all messed up. It felt awful, the misplacement. Peek! Cinder wailed. Peek startled before sprinting back at the monster who was struggling to his feet, Cinder's midsection gripped in his fist. Peek let out a caterwaul as he threw himself upon the monster's wrist. He bit down furiously. The iron taste of blood filled his senses. Light sparked in his eyes from the force that he was biting down. He could hear a scream, but he couldn't tell where it was coming from. A strong hand grabbed his neck before ripping him off the monster's wrist, skin and muscle coming with him before he was violently flung into a wall. He lay there stunned for a few seconds. He felt a furry presence gently nuzzling him and he blinked his eyes open. Cinder leaned over him, worried. Peek! Are you okay? The human is escaping. Izuku jumped to his feet before falling to his side, pain flaring up his leg. Ugh! He gasped. Had he overexerted himself? Wait, maybe if he turned human he'd be better. He'd always fought while human, so that had to be the problem. He felt his bones shift as he turned. He stood up a bit easier before limping quickly to the room the human was in. His blood trail was great for tracking. The human was shoving things in his pockets, his formerly white gloves now red with his own blood. His whimpering spoke to his injuries. He grinned before leaping at the man. He slammed the man's head backwards into the human bed frame, the man yelling once before going still. He still smelled alive, so it was fine. Izuku looked around. He was out of the room, so he could try and find a way to escape now. This would probably be a bit difficult, especially with his injury. Izuku might hate them, but he wasn't going to let this human attack them. The man strode to the door and opened it. Perfect. Wait, he could open doors when he was human. Duh, why hadn't he thought of that? He could so easily escape now. He turned and hurried back to where Cinder was. Cinder was going to be so excited when he heard this. Izuku ran over to Cinder, who was licking his fur down. Cinder! Guess what? He yelled. Cinder looked around wildly before looking at Izuku. He started to growl before pausing and taking a double look. Izuku laughed, feeling his vocal cords move painfully before he crouched down. A cat once again. Peek? Yeah, I guess it's been a really long time since I've seen you. I look so weird now. He gestured to himself with his head. Cinder looked at him before flicking his tail. Okay, was that what you wanted? To show me that you're still sometimes a furless human kitten? Izuku scoffed good-naturedly, too excited to tell Cinder about his plan for them to escape to be offended. No. I know how we can escape. Izuku's eyes must be worse than he thought after changing to human, because he could have sworn Cinder looked uncomfortable. I can just open the human's door. See? He hurried over to the door the humans had taken him and turned into an human and opened it. He looked back at Cinder while bouncing in place. "See, come on." He sat down ready to curl back into a cat. Cinder stayed where he was. "That's great, Peak. But I'm not. I'm staying here." Izuku stared in shock, feeling his bones move. "Cinder? What are you talking about? You promised." Izuku felt his voice drop into a whimper. But he couldn't stop it. His brother was leaving them again? "I know I didn't. I said I'd help you escape, but I like it here. So suck it up," Cinder hissed with an sad undertone. But Izuku was too angry and upset to hear it. No. You can't. What about Autumn and Nemophila and Sunlight? What about me?" Cinder looked uncomfortable now as he shifted. "You could stay with me? I bet the humans would be fine with everyone else coming. Please. You're hurt, you can't possibly." Cinder trailed off, pulling his ears down as Izuku jumped up, glaring angrily at him. "I can't what? Survive? Well, guess what, Red Eye, I survived fine without you. So just shut up." Cinder recoiled at the insult, but Izuku didn't care. He turned around and strode out, feeling his fur painfully recede into his skin as he forcefully stood up, his tail lashing behind him. He growled as he jumped out the window next to the door. He landed painfully, feeling a rock get embedded in his foot. He ignored it as he ran blindly. Stupid. Of course Cinder wouldn't want to be with him. He wasn't even a real cat. He had human blood. He was nothing more than a monster. Whatever, he didn't need him. Cinder chose the human life, but he was still a cat. It was fine. He didn't need him. Cats were solitary anyway, their family was just an outlier. Of course Cinder wouldn't want to be in their stupid cat-human mixture of a family. But if that was so, why did it hurt so much? Kid, stop please." A human voice rang out. He recognized the voice and turned his head slightly. It was one of the clowns who'd tried chasing him a while ago. He'd lost him easily. So Izuku just picked up the pace, sprinting towards an alley that looked somewhat familiar. And of course that was the moment that his leg decided to give out. He squealed, feeling his bone move in a way that was not an indicator that he was about to change forms as he stumbled to his hands. The weak fleshy things twanged painfully as he got back up, ducking into the alley. Loud clanky footsteps sounded at the entrance of the alley and he cursed. He looked around, hoping for a way to escape. Finally he saw a tiny squeezed space, too small for a human, even a child, but barely big enough for him to fit. With barely a second's deliberation he transformed, shoving himself down into the hole. Almost a quarter of a minute later the human walked up right next to him. He watched carefully, ready to bolt. But finally the human left. He sighed, getting up and walking out of the alley. He didn't bother to change to human. He'd get less attention in this form anyway. Izuku staggered, his legs burning. But it was worth it. He'd finally picked up Nemophila's scent. After walking for hours until the sun was setting, he'd found a stale scent. He'd followed it until it was fresh. "Nemophila." He yowled. "Peek?" A faint voice called. He sprinted in the direction of it until he painfully collided face first with his sister. "Ah, Peek? You're alive? You're alive." Nemophila picked her tail up, curling the tip. Peek looked down. She'd be even happier if Cinder was here. They were very close before Cinder ran off to be like a human. "Yes. And you're not going to like this, but so is." Izuku took a deep breath before rushing it out. "Soy, Cinder." He looked away from Nemophila before quickly looking back. She just looked bewildered. What am I not going to like?" Izuku shifted. He didn't think he could tell everyone multiple times. "Ask Autumn." He hurried towards the box and ducked in. There was a pause for a few seconds while Autumn and Sunlight stared at him. Then they bounded over, purring loudly. Izuku awkwardly greeted them, still wondering how to properly tell them that Cinder had abandoned them. "Autumn, I need to tell you something." He swallowed down the upset. "What's wrong, Peek? And is that another broken limb?" She stared down at his back leg. Izuku startled, then guiltily hid his leg behind the other. Maybe? But I've got bigger news." He tried to move on. But Autumn wasn't having it. "The way you're going to end up unable to hunt properly like me. It's a miracle you haven't ended up that way yet. Peek, please take better care of yourself." "What happened? Is this why you were gone for so long?" Izuku shifted. He really just wanted to get Cinder over with. "Yeah, it is why I was gone for so long. I got hit by one of those tin can things. The human who hit me took me to a place where they fixed my leg. I mean, only kinda, it still hurts to run on. But my wrist feels much better, so it's not that bad. Anyway, I need to tell you something really bad and good. Cinder is alive, but he's living with humans and has no intention of leaving. Autumn's expression slowly changed from worry to a mix of relief, sadness, and anger. What? How do you know? Did those humans who hit you take you to him? Izuku nodded. Oh. She looked down. Izuku glanced at Sunlight. He was staring silently. This had to be worse for them than Izuku, after all they'd known Cinder for basically his entire life. Izuku turned around and hurried out. Nemophila tilted her head as she carried a bird in, but Izuku just ignored her. He needed to get in a fight. Help. Please. Perfect. Well, not perfect there was a monster, but perfect that he could finally stop thinking about Cinder and what he could have said to make him come with Izuku. Peek ran towards the commotion as he turned into his human form and peeked over to get a look of the situation. There were 3 young humans threatening another one. They currently were just using body language, but Peek knew how fast that could change. He jumped down onto one. They went down hard. He bounced off the monster, barely dodging a false claw that was swung towards his eye. The victim suddenly lunged at his throat, white ropes wiggling from his human fingers. What? He growled at the new monster as he jumped over the ropes. One entangled itself around his ankle, fortunately his uninjured one, yanking him back towards the ground. Peek used this momentum to fully take out the human he'd attacked before. He ripped the rope apart with his claws before dodging 2 false claws aimed at his chest. He lunged at the closest monster, making sure to keep his claws retracted. He squeezed the monster's neck tightly before swinging him in front of the rope monster's attack, restraining him. Suddenly something grabbed at his neck. Screaming in surprise, he grabbed the monster's wrist and pulled himself up before bouncing backwards into something fleshy. An angry scream came from where he'd landed before the monster scratched him with its pitiful claws. Izuku easily slammed the monster's head backwards into a pile of garbage. The monster screamed in rage again as he reached its hand out for Izuku's neck. Izuku shook his head trying to get the monster's hand off. Finally he just slammed the back of his head into the monster, finally taking him out. 1 monster left. Izuku jumped at him. The monster closed his eyes. Izuku took that opportunity to cut his ropes apart before using them to restrain their own controller. He stood up looking down at the scene. How was he going to get someone to get rid of them? There were no victims to give a statement. They were all monsters. He punched a wall in anger. Stupid monsters making his life harder than it already was. Izuku wandered the streets. This time he knew what he was doing and wasn't half asleep. Mostly. He was searching for that human who'd fed him a few times. Why? He had no idea. He wasn't hungry at all, so it couldn't be he wanted food. He hadn't seen her in a while and he wanted to make sure she was okay. She got into fights with monsters a lot. He sniffed the air again. There was still no sign of her scent. Maybe she'd moved her territory over? He continued walking. His wrist was barely bugging him, thankfully, but his back leg was on fire. Thankfully not literally, but still. He decided to transform into his cat form. He had better smell, though it would take way longer to get places. Curse his injuries. While he explored beyond his comfort zone, he wondered what had happened while he was gone. His territory seemed so much more empty of monsters, and there were more clowns wandering around. Sure, it was only a few hours into the night, but usually they'd gone to sleep by now. They were all a bit duller than he was used to them being, but still brighter than Worm Neck. Which he was glad about. He didn't need a bunch of them chasing him. They usually left him alone, which was amazing. They'd talk to him a few times after he helped them with monsters or they helped him. He didn't exactly understand what they were telling him. Why are you out here so late? Why don't you turn yourself in? Eraserhead is only trying to help you. You won't get in much trouble if you turn yourself in willingly. You're young, they'll go easy on you. I'd grab you if you were my case. Izuku just hissed at all of them before crawling up the nearest building's wall. They never tried to chase him. But this was so frustrating. Why wasn't the human anywhere? If she was dead, he'd smell her body, right? Brats were annoying. Hisser had been avoiding him, but the heroes who he'd gotten to change their patrol routes up a bit had all seen him. Now technically he had refused to answer questions and hissed at them, but it was still frustrating that he was able to avoid Aizawa but not Nemuri, who wouldn't shut up. I'm just saying that it's funny that I was able to find him but you haven't found him for weeks. Aizawa glared at her with red eyes. Aren't you glad the kid is alive? I know your father instincts were going off when he disappeared for a couple weeks and came back with a broken leg and the still only partially healed wrist. I do not have father instincts. Then why did you come here to rant about your kid being a brat? She started cackling when Aizawa left the room. He did not have father instincts. He didn't even like children. Sure, he can tolerate comforting child victims. It's not their fault and they deserve a somewhat comforting presence. And yes, he was a teacher, but he was just making sure those idiots didn't get themselves or others killed because they didn't take heroics seriously. That doesn't mean he's a dad. He sighed as he took down a purse snatcher. He sighed as he was mocked again by Tsukuchi. The bastard. One of these days he was going to lace his coffee with laxatives and not feel sorry when he got arrested. Not that he would get arrested. He was too smart to get caught. Quirk was bored. It was an odd time to be bored since he was fighting a super pissed off monster. But he was still bored. You little asshole. Get the fuck back here. Quirk was a bit too pleased that he understood all of that. He darted under the man's arm before stomping on his foot hard. The human screamed in anger and hesitated for a second. Izuku continued running towards the alley wall before kicking off. He felt his head collide with the human's skull. The monster howled in pain and slumped forwards. Izuku winced as he gingerly shook his head. That plan had worked, but it still hurt. He turned to the sobbing human kitten and their mom. The kitten was tightly clutching their deathly still mother's pant leg. He swallowed down the painful memories and carefully crept towards the human. He crouched down and extended his hand towards the kid hesitantly. What was he supposed to do? He looked down at his hand and saw it had faint streaks of dried blood. He quickly drew it back, instead choosing to scooch closer. The kitten let out a strangled sound before throwing himself forwards. Izuku let out a muffled choke and barely refrained from scratching the human kitten. Help her. Why didn't you help my mommy? You're a bad hero. The human sobbed into Izuku's clothing as he clutched him tightly. Izuku shifted uncomfortably before carefully patting the kitten's fluffy head. He could feel his shirt getting wet from all the tears the human was letting out, but he didn't care much. The human sobbed for a while before his sobs got more subdued. Izuku carefully stood up, taking their hand gently. He'd take them to the blue-furred humans. They were annoying, but they helped. He started to walk before turning back to the monster. He couldn't leave him here for him to break apart another family. He scowled as he looked at the monster. He lay with his back turned to the human he'd killed. Izuku wasn't entirely sure when she'd died. She'd been fine before he started to fight. But either way she was dead and gone. Beyond saving. Like a cat who'd been killed by a dog before being left to rot in a back alley until a human cleaned them up. He shook his head forcefully, turning away from the human and the monster. The kitten would probably show the other humans to the body and the monster. And if Izuku saw him free again, he'd have another human's blood on his claws. Izuku walked away from the humans with the kitten in their midst. He needed to get back to the monster before he woke up and left. He wouldn't let another human down tonight. When he arrived at the alley, the monster was still unconscious. Izuku glared at him, summoning all his hate. I hope you get what you deserve, you despicable piece of absolute shit. If I knew where you lived, I'd burn your house down with you in before throwing you into a bunch of flames. How dare you kill a human and try and kill a kitten, you stupid rat-faced feces-eyed toenailless pathetic dog. Izuku sighed and turned to look out of the alley towards the blue-furred humans' territory. What was taking them so long? Usually they were here by now. Had there been another bigger monster? Or was the kid too scared to remember where the monster and his mother was? He sat down on the edge of the roof, letting his feet dangle over. He clicked his tongue in annoyance. Maybe he should just drag the monster to the humans? Though he'd pushed it tonight with the human child, they'd been so distracted in making sure the human was okay and he hadn't hurt them to try and catch him. Stupid humans. He went to stand back up to pace. Fire erupted on his back and he screamed, stumbling forwards into the alley with the monster. He felt his knee crack on the pavement as he landed badly, twisting his head up to see what had happened. A huge human with fire all over his costume glared down at him. He jumped down the ground shaking. Izuku twitched his tail as he cautiously backed away from the human. The monster looked down his nose at Izuku and showed his teeth. Vigilantes like you deserve to burn. He threw his hand out, shooting fire at Izuku. Izuku screeched as he threw himself out of the way. The fire barely missed him, but Izuku could feel the heat it let off. He staggered to his hands and knees, trying to turn into a cat to run off. With a gasp of horror, he realized he couldn't transform. He curled in as the monster approached him, feeling his entire body shaking with fear. What kind of human was he? He looked like one of those clowns, but he acted like a monster. Even Worm Neck hadn't tried to kill him on that roof. The monster lifted his foot and put it on Izuku's chest. Izuku gasped in pain as his back was grinded down into the pavement. The human lifted his hand to his ear and growled out, I've got a villain on XXXXXXX. There's an unconscious man and woman here. Izuku frantically squirmed. From the monster clown's description, he thought the monster was a victim, and he couldn't allow that. The clown monster just pressed him further into the ground. Izuku's vision started getting a bit fuzzy as he wheezed. What was happening? Why wasn't he able to force the monster off him? Stop SSTPP stop. He choked out, flexing his fingers before digging his claws into the monster's heel as a last-ditch effort. The monster barely grimaced as he reached down, taking out something gray and shiny from his belt. Izuku tried to focus his eyes as the monster crouched down. He finally focused to see it was the object that the blue-furred humans used to trap monsters' hands. He wasn't doing this. He wasn't. He growled, pulling his ears back as he pulled his hands away from the monster's leg as far away as he could get them as he kicked at the monster, lashing out desperately. The monster's hand passed close to Izuku's face and Izuku lunged forwards. He dug his teeth into the monster's wrist. He bit down harder than he had with even worm neck. The monster yelled before flaring his fire up along his arm. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut as the fire jumped into his mouth. He pulled his face away, coughing. The monster raised his hand to his eyes before muttering something in anger. His eyes moved to a spot just above Izuku's head. He started to reach out and Izuku jerked backwards. He slid for a second as the monster staggered. The monster turned around and shot fire directly at Izuku's chest. Izuku jumped up, crashing into an alley wall. He shook his head before staggering out of the alley. Loud noises registered in his ear, as did someone yelling. He picked up the pace, hurrying to another alley entrance that he knew was confusing to navigate. He felt heat at his back and ducked down. With a final burst of energy he sprinted into the alley, ducking and dodging into different ones. After a while he felt the energy leave as he staggered to the ground. He silently begged to be left alone. After a few minutes of lying there in pain almost as bad as the time he was hit by the tin can, he regained the ability to stand. He clenched his teeth as he stood up, doing his best to not let the few scraps of remaining clothing to touch his back. He turned around and made his way out of the alley. He cautiously peeked out, but the monster wasn't there anymore. He sighed with relief and tried to change into his cat form. He still couldn't. Guess he would just have to make his way home like a human. He used the buildings to help prop him up as he made his way in the direction of the box. Maybe Autumn would know how to fix this. He'd almost made it back to the box when loud siren noises sounded. Surprised, he toppled sideways into an alley as the tin can sped past. He cursed silently as he got up and glared at them. They pulled to a stop a few hundred feet away. He froze. That was right in front of his box. He quickly staggered over towards the box, ready to protect his home. A couple blue-furred humans hurried over towards a human with worm neck. Izuku glared at him, flexing his claws. The humans trapped her hands and started to lead her over towards the tin cans. Izuku huffed as he looked away from it. Suddenly an extremely familiar scent reached his nose. He snapped his neck back over to stare at the human. He silently gasped. It was the woman he'd saved and been looking for. As she was driven away, Izuku stood there angered. Wormneck took something out of his pocket before using the worm to swing away. How dare he? Izuku felt hate rise in him as he clenched his fist. Wormneck couldn't just go away and mind his own business. He had to be a stupid meddling jerk. Izuku shook as he finally managed to turn into a cat. He wouldn't let Wormneck take away any more of his family. Tsukuchi stared at the woman handcuffed to a table in front of him. She smiled back. Let me get this straight, he slowly said, looking up at Yukichi. The woman who'd made eye contact with Eraserhead, smiled, then threw a fucking brick through a jewelry store window in front of him. You wanted to get arrested so you could ask to help catch Hisser? Why not call the police and leave an anonymous tip, or even come into the station? Mentally he noted that if she really wanted to arrest him she could have just used her quirk and gone full vigilante. So what was she playing at? Was she trying to get off lighter? No, that didn't add up. If she wanted to get off lighter she wouldn't have thrown a brick through a window in front of a hero. Was she stupid? Yukichi's smile dimmed a bit as she slumped down in her seat. I don't want to arrest the kid, I want to help him. He's really skittish, like a feral cat, which means he needs help, she said with complete confidence. True. Tsukuchi massaged his forehead while trying to make it seem like he wasn't. Right. So what exactly was your plan when you got arrested? Yukichi smiled larger. I'm glad you asked. True. Fuck. Why was she smiling like Nizu? Why was she so happy about being arrested? Why couldn't he have a normal jewelry store robbery? Why was every night like this? Tsukuchi sighed as Yukichi practically skipped out of the police station. She'd still have to have a trial, but for now she was essentially on probation under a few terms. First, no more throwing bricks through windows to get the attention of heroes. He'd told her that if she needed anything to just walk into the station. He was only 80% sure she would. Second, Not to go gallivanting off to attempt to talk Hisser into turning himself in. He was 30% sure she'd listen to that instruction. Third, any information that technically could go public they'd give straight to her. Which was basically nothing, but she'd looked happy that she'd get something. And fourth, if she heard anything relating to him, to give it to them straightforwardly rather than whatever had just happened. Tsukuchi really did not want to deal with two vigilantes running around. Hisser had already killed 2 villains and beaten up a number of other ones. The villains he'd killed had either been accidentally, according to witness statements, or had been necessary to save his life or civilians. But if the kid escalated, things could get bad fast. He'd already been noted to have a very black and white view of things, especially after his encounter tonight with Endeavor. He could easily be pushed off the edge and go full villain. Tsukuchi didn't want to have to put him in jail. Izuku hissed angrily as he finished his story. Then he hissed in pain as Autumn gently licked his back again. Sorry Peak, I'm almost done. How'd you get so much dirt on your back? Some clown monster. But I got away from them pretty easily once I got up. But aren't you worried about the human? What human? Autumn absently-mindedly asked as she backed away from his back. Izuku spluttered. The human who got taken by Worm Neck. Why'd he mess with her? She's the only remotely nice human it seems. He whined. Autumn gently cuffed him over the head. I don't want you going out tonight, Peak. The burns are fairly mild, for burns, but for a few days it'll hurt badly. Preferably not tomorrow night either, but if you really need to go out and do your fighting thing I can't stop you. Izuku jumped up, knocking his head into her shoulder enthusiastically. I promise not to go out tonight. Sunlight walked in, a rat in his teeth. He looked at Autumn and Izuku before huffing. Autumn, did Peak hurt himself again? Is this going to be a nightly thing? Izuku hissed at his brother, who flicked his ear in response. Sunlight bounced over, dropping the rat in front of Autumn. I ate already. And Peak, the sun is rising, which means you won't go out again, correct? Izuku drew his ears back, glaring at his brother. He couldn't stop rubbing it in, huh? Yeah, I just said that. Sunlight thrashed his tail mockingly. I'm deaf, how could I hear that? Izuku drew his ears back, glaring. Autumn just sighed and picked up the rat, taking it to the corner that they usually ate in. Izuku huffed and stalked over to the corner he enjoyed sleeping in grumpily. Then his stupid brain just had to remind him Cinder used to sleep right next to him here. He growled, clawing at the box aggressively. Everything was stupid. Izuku crouched down at the edge of a building as he watched a group of 7 humans wander along a street noisily, practically stomping. Izuku flicked his ear, annoyed at the incessant noise. If he was any younger and more hard-headed, he might have jumped down and hissed at them to get them to stop, but being loud and annoying wasn't the mark of a monster. Unfortunately, he huffed through his nose as one of them kicked an empty bottle into the alley to the side of Izuku. The loud shattering told the fate of the poor bottle. The humans found that hilarious as boisterous laughter rang from the group. Izuku rolled his eyes. Izuku went to turn away to look for real monsters when the group suddenly went as silent as most humans could be. Now a bit worried, as humans rarely went silent unless something was terribly wrong, he turned back to the humans and peeked over the edge again. They were all gathered around the door of another building. One human stood at the door, crouched over the handle. Izuku frowned as he leaned further over. What were they doing? He'd never seen humans act this kind of weird before. Did they get locked out of their home? He'd never seen the humans in that building use it as a home before. But humans were very unpredictable. Izuku jumped down, ready to help them unlock the door. It was a slow night and he was here to help the weak humans, when the door made a loud snapping sound. Izuku froze as he stared at the humans slapping each other's hands excitedly. That didn't sound very good. Good job, Kuriku. Now everyone put your masks on. The loudest yelled. The humans all pulled fabric from their clothing folds and put them over their faces before ambling casually into the building. Now a bit curious on what was going on, Izuku followed them in quietly. The humans wandered to shelves and started grabbing shiny rocks. The only woman in the group took a chain of white beads and slipped them on over her neck before posing in a mirror. Izuku must have breathed too loudly or something, because she suddenly swerved around and cried out, "Oh no!" Izuku ducked as something whistled above his head. The humans all rushed at him. "I'm not going to jail. Get out of my way, Tsume." The girl shoved the shortest in the group out of the way as she raised her hand towards Izuku. Pete threw himself backwards, feeling something crack against his still tender back as he slammed into a display case. He hissed in pain as he threw himself to the side of a short stream of flames. They were nowhere near as hot as the monster from before were, so he took a breath and lunged towards one who'd been separated by a few feet. He kicked out, feeling his foot connect with his chest as he kicked the man backwards to the floor. He didn't get up again. Something whipped past his head and he flinched before realizing it was aimed at the fire monster. Hono raised his hands to send out another stream of fire before pausing, to stare down at his hands. He was quickly taken out. Peak swiveled around to see Worm Neck glaring past him, his hair raised in the air threateningly. But Peak wasn't scared. No, he was pissed. Who did this human think he was to do this? Peak wasn't sure what exactly he was trying to be mad at him about other than he'd taken the seemingly only truly nice human. Peak was so busy glaring at Worm Neck he didn't see Tsume until he felt a pain like when a rat scratched at him on his arm. He grunted and flung the human who had small claws away from him before leaping at him. Tsume screeched and tried to jump backwards again but didn't get very far. Peak grabbed Tsume's short fur and used it as a handhold to slam Tsume's head into the hard floor. He gasped before his eyes rolled back. Peak jumped away from Tsume as a false claw slashed where he'd just been. The human who'd tried to slit his throat glared at him as she stood over her fallen friend protectively. "You stupid heroes always meddle," she screamed angrily, slashing defensively in front of her to keep Peak away from them. Peak crouched down ready to lunge. "Why aren't you saying anything? Too good to even spare a single word for the likes of me?" "You fool!" Worm Neck jumped past him, causing Peak to hiss angrily and slash at him before landing on her. He grabbed her fake claw and flung it away from her. While Worm Neck was doing that, Peak turned around and clawed the monster, trying to sneak up on him hard. The monster yelled in anger as he clutched at his cheek. His hands lit up with light before he flung them outwards. Peak barely had a chance to blink before he was thrown backwards through one of the glass displays into the wall to exit the store. He whimpered involuntarily as the monster took the time to gloat. "What? Scared?" He ran at Izuku, his hands lit up again. Izuku tried to get up but his only half-healed leg screamed in protest. He grunted, gritting his teeth as he tried to stand to face the monster. Then there was a crunch. Izuku snapped his head up to stare at Worm Neck, who'd broken the monster's nose. His face was screwed up in anger, which was something he'd never seen him look like before, even when Izuku took a chunk of his wrist. What was he so mad about? Worm Neck kicked the monster to the ground before taking out the metal object to trap his hands. Then he looked up at Izuku almost immediately after that, shooting his weapon at him. Izuku squawked in surprise, somehow dodging it again as he ducked behind a shattered glass display. He had to move almost immediately after as Worm Neck vaulted over the display, throwing the weapon at him again. Izuku ran towards an unconscious monster, yelping every step as glass dug into his feet. The weapon grabbed at his ankle, thankfully the uninjured leg, tripping him. Izuku landed on top of the monster hard, feeling all the air exit him. "Hisser, stop resisting. I'm not trying to hurt you," Worm Neck yelled, and Izuku glared at the ground in response. He kicked his free leg along the fabric wrapped around his leg, trying to rip it to shreds. It didn't work. He looked around for another way to escape. He didn't know what would happen when he got caught by a human, but he definitely didn't want to find out. He'd heard the tales from other alley cats. He didn't want his balls cut off. He saw a black weapon with yellow on it. Worm Neck was still talking, but he was barely listening. After making sure it wouldn't kill Worm Neck, he grabbed it and aimed it at him. "Still young, you've got your whole life ahead, hey. Put that down." Izuku didn't listen and clicked the trigger, hoping it would work and not kill Worm Neck. The dart struck his arm and the weapon loosened almost unnoticeably. Worm Neck froze. An expression of pain crossed his face as he fell down to one knee. Izuku wasted no time in unraveling the weapon as quickly as he could. He carefully walked past Worm Neck, who was still wheezing in pain. Izuku shifted uncomfortably, feeling a little bad for shooting Worm Neck before he ran out the door into a nearby alley. He shook the weird feeling off, sneaking a look back over his shoulder. He hadn't seen anyone get up yet, so Worm Neck would be fine. Probably. Izuku felt the excursion of the night finally catch up to him after he'd wandered the alleys away from Worm Neck for a bit. His back was on fire, thankfully not literally this time, and likely had some glass in it judging by the pricking feeling. His leg was pulsating painfully, and his wrist was twisted in a way that he couldn't fix by moving it. He shifted more of his weight to his other leg, deciding he'd go back to the box for tonight. Autumn would flip if she found out he was willingly continuing to run around like this. He turned around to head back towards the box when someone came around the corner. Izuku stiffened, fearing for a moment that Worm Neck had followed him somehow. But then a familiar and much more friendly scent than Worm Neck's sweaty worry smell. Don't ask why he always smelled worried. Izuku had no clue. Came to him a moment before he fully registered the human standing in front of him, softly smiling. "Hey there, Hisser. The woman softly greeted him. She held something that smelled amazing in her hands and Izuku twitched wanting to take it. You look hurt, what happened? The woman continued. Izuku tilted his head trying to decipher what she was trying to say. Hisser? Wait, can you hear me? She gasped and took a few steps forwards. Izuku flinched and took more backwards. Oh. Sorry. The woman tilted her head looking at Izuku almost thoughtfully. As she did that she opened the food and put it in front of her. But she didn't step back. Izuku huffed as he stared at the food a foot away from her. Well. She'd never heard him before and he was a bit hungry. It couldn't hurt. He cautiously approached, reaching a hand out for the food. He grabbed it quickly and pulled it towards himself, proceeding to dig in. He didn't even notice the woman approaching. When she did, he barely moved away, too excited by the food to be scared or cautious. The woman carefully crouched down and examined his wrist. Apparently she was happy with what she saw when she nodded to herself. She went to stand up before staring at his leg. Kid, did you break your leg? Why have you been running around? She choked out, staring at his leg. Izuku wanted to look down at his leg that he knew was still a bit crooked after running around so much, but the food was much too important. I've been researching proper medical techniques than what I already know with my quirk. I can try and make it better. I won't make it worse at the least. Izuku blinked at her. Oh right, sorry. Blink once if you're okay with me trying to fix it and twice if you don't want me to. She confidently told him. Then she paused. Oh wait. Then she turned to look him directly in the face before pointing at his leg. Do you want me to fix that? He winced at the loud tone, tilting his head back away from her. She seemed to take it as an agreement of some kind as she started poking and prodding his leg. He finished snarfing the meaty meal down, doing his best to not grimace when she poked a sore spot on his leg every now and then. As he finished the last of the food, he suddenly had a horrible thought. He wasn't scared of this human at all. He was warming up. He shuddered. Wasn't this what Cinder had done? He was so mad at Cinder for running off to be a pet, but he was allowing a human to mess with his injured leg? What was wrong with him? My name's Yukichi, by the way, little vigilante. The human, whose name was apparently Yukichi, chirped. Izuku nodded, then paused. Since when did he nod like a human? This was horrible. Yukichi looked surprised for a second before clapping her hands once. And something tells me that you're not getting all the things like proper food that a kid like you needs. So I'm going to help you. Izuku stared off into the distance as Yukichi wrapped a bandage around his leg that would fall off as soon as he turned into his cat form. He sullenly sat there for a bit as Yukichi admired her handiwork, talking to herself about how good she was at medical shit. Finally she left his leg alone and picked up the container where the food had once been. She waved over her shoulder before walking off. Izuku stood up and climbed up onto a roof to take a shortcut to his box as the sun was rising. Then he climbed straight back down as Worm Neck jumped over the roofs in his view, quickly approaching. Had he seen him? He didn't want to find out, and so he ran away again. He didn't make it back to the box until the sun was half in the sky. Izuku winced in pain as his family yanked glass out of his back. The way you're going to become bald on your back before you finally become full grown, Autumn scolded as she roughly yanked a particularly large piece of glass out of his back. Izuku bit down another yelp as he dug his claws further into the box floor. Are we done yet? He whined, drawing out the E and yet. His answer was a claw dug into his back as Nemophila clawed a piece of glass that had gotten buried deep in his tender skin. Sunlight cuffed him on the neck, avoiding the half-healed burn and the phantom pricks. You're a fur brain, you know that, right? His sister told him. Izuku whined again in protest. I'm not. It's not my fault that the monsters were stupid and somehow made me get thrown into glass and stuff. He yelped again as another piece of glass was pulled out of his shoulder blade and tossed into the pile. I think we got them all, Peak. Can you not get into fights for a night, please? You used to be so much more careful and came back with scrapes at the worst. Stop being so reckless, Autumn scolded as she backed away, licking her paw that had a few traces of Izuku's blood on it. Izuku reluctantly nodded, knowing she was right. He used to be much better at avoiding head-on fights, but recently with the increase of clowns and Worm Neck searching for him, it was harder to avoid them. As an unfortunate bonus, the monsters tended to work in groups of 2 or more now. At the start of his work they usually traveled alone, which was certainly a viable option. Izuku hadn't seen any clowns fight them. As far as he knew, he was the first to challenge their territories for years. They'd gotten comfortable, but now they were on guard. At least any clowns who were in the area weren't only for him now. He'd seen a few take down a monster holding a kitten hostage. He tried to ignore the pain still shooting up his back. It would fade eventually. The sun had set and now Izuku was weighing the pros and cons of going out. Cons. He hadn't slept at all. He was still injured. Worm Neck was still wandering around. With his injuries, the chances of him getting killed or captured by a clown or Worm Neck were twice as likely. Autumn would probably yell at him if he did. Pros. He might see that human and get food. He was going out. Izuku snuck out past Autumn, decimating some rat that had gotten too close to her favorite ambush area and quickly turned into a human. He put his clothing on and frowned at the back of his hoodie. It was completely shredded, barely being held together by a few threads. He was fine with this tonight with the still fresh injuries on his back, but on the future it could be problematic. Maybe if it hadn't been destroyed by the clown's fire he wouldn't have gotten as much glass shoved in his back. He carefully put the clothing on, only wincing once before hurrying off. He kept an eye out for any monsters, but tonight was surprisingly quiet. He only kicked one human in the balls on his way to where he'd last seen the human. Finally he arrived crouching on the building. He could feel his tail twitching in hope of the food from last time. He forced it down. The woman might not even come and he shouldn't be so excited. He wasn't even a human. Why was he so invested in them anyway? He froze, nearly toppling off the edge. What was he doing? Coming back to a human for food? He felt acid rise in his throat. What right did he have to get so mad at Cinder when he was such a hypocrite? Sure, he had no plans of becoming a pet, but he was still a traitor to his family for getting human food for himself. He clenched his fist, feeling his claws dig into his palms painfully. He winced but ignored it. He'd felt worse. Izuku took a small breath in before retracting his claws. He shuddered at the weird feeling of his skin moving back towards the correct direction. He looked down, sniffing the air. A faint scent of something familiar entered his nose and he bit his tongue. The human was here. He looked backwards. She wouldn't be able to tell if he left right, but she smelled like she'd brought food, which was why he'd come out here in the first place. He sighed as she entered the alley. The food did smell really good. He jumped down, making her jump a little bit before showing her teeth. Izuku blinked before reminding himself that humans usually did that when happy. They were weird. She put the food down before taking a few steps back. Izuku approached the food and she nodded sharply as if to herself before beginning to talk. Izuku allowed it to become background noise as he ate. A few of the words he recognized, but the others were rather foreign to him. When he finished the meal, the human also seemed to finish whatever she was talking about. Well, little hisser, I've got to get back to my job, you know. Work all day, pay the bills I got to pay. She stood up and Izuku held the container out to her. She looked surprised for a second before smiling and taking it. Thank you. Well, now I've really got to go. The sun is about to rise. Izuku looked up and sure enough the sky was starting to lighten. Izuku looked at her, hesitating for a second before nodding. For some reason she looked really happy about that and practically skipped away. Izuku clambered back onto the roof. That would be the quickest way back to the box. He started to hurry on his way back. Autumn might be mad that he went out, but at least he didn't get in any real fights. He flexed his rather sore legs, sitting on the floor while human was really uncomfortable, and started to hurry back. Suddenly he heard the sound of something zipping towards him and instinctively he rolled to the side. He could feel rocks dig into his back and he hissed. He swiveled his head around to his left to glare at Worm Neck, who was standing in a ready position, his hand gripped tightly around the worm as he drew it back around his neck. I'm only here to talk, hisser. I swear. To demonstrate his point he pointedly put his hands in his pockets. Pete drew his ears back and stepped to the side. Worm Neck sighed. Look, kid, I've said this before, but what you're doing is dangerous. I've tried bringing you in by force, but maybe I should have tried other tactics first. Worm Neck went silent as if he was waiting for a response. Izuku cocked his head in response and Worm Neck sighed again. I know you think you're helping, and you somewhat are, but you're untrained. Someday you're going to mess up and get the person you're trying to save killed or yourself. If you come with me, we could potentially get you properly trained and lower the risk of that. Izuku processed what he said slowly. He understood Worm Neck much more than the first time Worm Neck had tried to talk him into stopping his night activities. Worm Neck took his silence as an opportunity to continue. If you're in a situation in which you need help, we could help you. You don't have to resort to vigilantism. Izuku frowned as he heard the final bit. He'd heard the clowns call him a vigilante before, and vigilantism was probably another word for it, but he still didn't know what it meant. Worm Neck removed his hands from his pockets and Izuku stiffened, ready to bolt. But he simply took a pouch of something from his pocket and tossed it with an underhand throw to Izuku. The pouch smacked Izuku's arm and he grabbed it before it fell to the ground. He looked at it confused. It's a food pouch. That flavor is banana. Worm Neck took another one out of his pocket and opened it before eating it. Izuku stared at him puzzled. He looked down at the pouch and back at Worm Neck. Then he took off. Aizawa jolted as Hisser ran off with the fruit pouch clutched in his hand. He could chase him, but that would ruin what he was trying to achieve. Aizawa frowned. The kid was really jumpy. And sure, that might just be because he was a vigilante and Aizawa was a pro hero and had attempted to arrest him on numerous occasions. But it had seemed like he was getting around to him at least a little. Hisser had seemed to be paying attention when he tried to talk him out of vigilantism, badly, but he'd had that look on his face right before he tased him and strolled out of the jewelry store, so it was hard to tell. Why was it so hard to read him? At least he'd gotten a bit more information. Sure, it was only his hair color, but it was recognizable enough that if he saw him on the street in civilian clothing he might be able to recognize him. After all, green fluffy hair with seemingly random streaks of white-gray through it wasn't that common. Aizawa pinched his nose in an attempt to ward off the sudden thought of potentially fostering Hisser. Why had he even thought about considering that? Hisser could have a family that was loving, just really oblivious. Hisser didn't even like him that much, and neither did Aizawa. Hisser was a pain in the neck, and it was incredibly dangerous with both his and Hisashi's careers. Sure, Hisser could protect himself more than the average 7 to 10-year-old, but Aizawa and Hisashi had both made some powerful enemies. Most were in prison, but if they ever got out and got a whiff of Hisser he could be killed. So he couldn't even consider this. It was illogical. Yet he continued to wonder what having Hisser as a son would be like. Then he pinched himself before jumping off to take out some criminals to take his mind off the illogical emotions. Nope, wasn't going to even think about that. Nope. He was honestly kind of surprised he'd gotten away with stealing a new hoodie and a shirt from the same store again. He didn't really feel bad for doing it, after all they'd hit him in the rump one too many times. Most of those times he wasn't even stealing anything. He was just walking by in his cat form and suddenly got smacked with a broom. He glanced down at the new hoodie he held tightly in his jaw as he dragged it back towards an alley to make sure it would work for him. This time he'd grabbed a dark green hoodie. This one had long strings coming out of it which he planned to chew off later. The smarter monsters might try and use them as a grip to take him down. While he was thinking, someone barreled into his side, knocking him over and causing the hoodie to fall out of his jaws into a puddle. He cried out, mentally frowning about his ribs. Hopefully they were only bruised. He glared up at the person who'd tripped over him only to not see anyone there. He looked around to see them sprinting off into the distance. He tilted his head in confusion. Then he ducked down as another human leapt over him, crying out for another. He turned towards where they'd come from and saw a small stream of people fleeing. He narrowed his eyes before ducking into the alley. Thank everything his pants were in this alley. He quickly got dressed before climbing up onto a roof, going the opposite way of the panicking humans. Soon he arrived at a small building. It would have looked pretty cool if it wasn't for the unnatural fire coming out of a window while the walls were at the beginning of crumbling into nothing. Screams rang from inside and Pete quickly got to work. He climbed in through what probably was once a window before landing as quietly as he could when there was smashed glass. He glanced around quietly, wondering how there was so little smoke. His eyes landed on a small cluster of humans who weren't moving, half under a chunk of ceiling. He quickly jumped over, smelling death. Only a few still had any life smells. He carefully removed those that did and took them out through the window he came in. Loud noises rang in his ears and he walked a bit faster. The blue-furred humans might leave him alone until he finished, but once he finished, chances were that they'd immediately try to convince him to come with them or simply just attempt to grab him like a few times. He smelled the air again. A few scents of stale life filled his nose while charred flesh nearly overrode it. There was only 2 more scents of life left in the building. In the back, he carefully walked around the tables that had been split in half and thrown across the room and pointedly ignored the corpse that had been skewered by a splintered chair. He shuddered as the smell of fear from one of the humans rolled over him. It was heavy. The other's emotions smelled familiar. Too familiar. He ran into the back room, pushing the monster away from the terrified human. The monster stumbled away but didn't fall. He looked up at Peek and grinned, showing all of his dull yellow teeth. Got a wannabe hero here? Think you can beat me? Ha! The monster threw his hands at Peek and the building vibrated. Peek stumbled as he looked to the shaking human next to him. The human's green hair was flailing around and it took a second for Peek to realize that they were snakes. He huffed before moving away from the human so the monster couldn't see them as easily. Then he slashed at the monster's neck. As he thought, the ground vibrated so hard his vision went white and he missed. A punch hit his stomach and he choked on his spit as he stumbled to the ground. He heard a cry and he flapped his hand in the direction of the human who had yet to flee. He wheezed as he rolled to the side as the monster slashed a fake claw. What was he thinking trying to fight? He should have just grabbed the human and ran. It was too late now. Regretting it now? You should. The monster cackled as he grabbed Izuku's ear tightly. Izuku screamed as suddenly his entire body started vibrating. It hurt. He blindly reached out and grabbed the arm. He dug his claws in until he felt himself hit something hard before continuing to dig in. He heard screaming. It took a moment to realize it was both his and the monster's voice. Peak lunged forwards out of the loosened grip and sunk his teeth into something soft and fleshy. His vision cleared enough to see he was leaned over the monster's body. He released the monster, who was feebly moving before staggering to his feet. Something warm and tasting of iron filled his mouth as a liquid dripped down his chin and down his throat. He brought his hand to his chin and wiped it away. New blood streaks stained his hands and he was sure his hoodie had gotten new stains. He turned back towards the human who was staring in fear. He grimaced at the taste of blood. Not because he hated it, but because it was probably a bit scary for the human in front of him. It's okay, human. I canna, you now. He took a step forwards and the human scuttled backwards. He froze. He'd never had someone be so scared of him before. He took a smaller step forwards and the human flinched. Izuku glanced back to the monster who was still shaking. He willn't hurt you, human. Come with E so I will get you out for this PLL place falls. The human let out a low keening sound. Izuku tilted his head. Are you scared? I see. A loud whistle hit his ears and he staggered away confused. He turned his head to see a blue-furred human holding an oddly shaped whistle in his hands. He blew on it again and Izuku hissed as he skittered away, shaking his head to stop the vibrations. I'm sorry for this, hisser. A voice murmured. It sounded like it was underwater. Something small and sharp hit his arm and an artificial wave of calmness hit him. He staggered backwards, throwing his arms out for defense. His ankle hit something and he fell down like a bag of bricks, his head bouncing off the floor hard. He cried out as he pushed himself to his hands and knees. Through blurry spots over his eyes he could see the blue-furred human checking over the monster before minutely shaking his head. The human shook and cried off the arm of another blue-furred human as the one with the whistle began to approach Izuku. Don't resist. Your ears can't take another blow of this whistle and I don't want to hurt you. I'm sorry, I have already. Izuku dug his claws into the floor as he tried to drag himself away. His claws suddenly shrunk until they were nubs. He gasped as he clutched his head as a wave of pain came over his head before fading, taking with it some of his awareness. He shook his head trying to stay awake. He couldn't go out like this. What about all the humans who needed help? What about the monsters who'd take advantage of them? What about Autumn, Nemophila, and Sunlight? What about Cinder, who was still convinced that staying with Wormneck was the best course of action? He could feel his muscles shaking against the poison that was trying to make him relax. OOEPHRWL. Ooh. He could feel something cold wrap around his wrists before tightening slightly. He flinched as he tried to throw himself away from the human, but they held him down firmly. He bit out blindly as consciousness